There is a small crescent of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that most people have never heard of. You would not find it easily on a map. You would not notice it from a passing ship. It barely rises above the waterline. Its highest point sits less than 10 feet above sea level. The entire island, every inch of it, could fit inside a modest American county fairground with room to spare. But in the third week of November, 1943, that nameless sliver of sand and coral became the most contested ground on the face of the earth. It became a place where men waded through chest-deep water under fire for 500 yards, where boys from Indiana and Texas and Georgia died before they ever touched the beach. It became a name that Marine Corps veterans would carry inside them for the rest of their lives, quietly, heavily, like something they could never quite put down. The island was called Betio, the atoll was called Tarawa, and the battle that erupted on its lagoon shore on the 20th of November, 1943, lasted 76 hours. 76 hours, 3 days and 4 hours. In that time, more than 1,000 United States Marines and Navy personnel were killed. More than 2,000 were wounded. Nearly 4,700 Japanese defenders died, all but 17 of them, not captured, not retreated, dead, an entire garrison, gone. What happened on that island was not simply a battle. It was a collision between two opposing philosophies of war, two different understandings of what a human being was willing to endure before they broke, and what happened when neither side broke at all. Before we spend these hours together walking through every chapter of that story, the planning, the politics, the tides that turned against the men in the water, the individual acts of courage that still feel almost impossible to comprehend, I want you to understand something. This is not a story about glory. There is very little glory in the coral shallows off Betio. This is a story about cost, about what it costs to make a mistake when the stakes are measured not in dollars or prestige, but in the lives of young men who had no say in the decision. And it is a story about what happens afterward, how lessons paid for in blood become doctrine, and doctrine becomes the machinery that saves the next generation from suffering the same fate. If any of this sounds like something worth understanding, settle in. We have a long way to go. Chapter 1. The world that made Tarawa necessary. Somewhere in the broad middle of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 2,400 miles southwest of Honolulu, lies a chain of islands that most of the world had never thought about before. The autumn of 1943, the Gilbert Islands, a scattered arc of low coral atolls straddling the equator, had no oil, no rare minerals, no harbors deep enough for a fleet. What they had was position. Geographic position of the kind that, in the calculus of mid-20th century naval warfare, was worth more than almost anything else you could name. They sat like stepping stones across the central Pacific, and whoever held them held the ability to control the air lanes and sea lanes that connected the Eastern Pacific to the heart of Japan's entire island empire. It was that simple and that brutal. Geography made Tarawa necessary. Geography made it worth dying for. To understand why nearly 18,000 Marines were loaded onto ships in the autumn of 1943 and pointed toward a reef in the middle of nowhere, you have to go back further. You have to go back to the arguments that were happening in the highest levels of American command in the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor. When the United States was still trying to understand the shape of the war it had just entered, two competing visions of how to defeat Japan were pulling at each other in meeting rooms and command tents across the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American forces in the Southwest Pacific, believed the road to Tokyo ran through the Philippines. His strategy was geographic, almost personal: fight up through New Guinea, reclaim the Philippines, then drive north. Admiral Chester Nimitz saw it differently. Nimitz believed the answer was a direct drive across the Central Pacific, island by island, atoll by atoll, cutting Japan's supply lines, isolating her garrison islands, and bringing American air power within striking range of the Japanese home islands. The Joint Chiefs of Staff ultimately chose to pursue both strategies simultaneously, but it was Nimitz's vision, the Central Pacific drive, that would send the Marines to Tarawa. The strategic logic was demanding and unforgiving. Japan had spent the better part of the previous 2 years constructing a defensive perimeter across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. That perimeter was built on a chain of island bases, each one functioning as a link in a great defensive arc. To push toward Japan's inner defensive ring, the Marianas, the Philippines, ultimately the home islands themselves, American forces first had to break through the outer ring. The Gilbert Islands were that outer ring. Tarawa Atoll, and specifically the tiny island of Betio at its southwestern corner, was the most important position in that ring because it held an airfield. Not a great airfield, not a beautiful one, but a working airfield, capable of supporting aircraft that could contest American air operations across the Central Pacific. Take the airfield, and you gain a forward base. Lose it to the Japanese, and the entire Central Pacific drive stalls before it starts. The airfield was the reason. Everything else, every decision, every compromise, every mistake and act of courage that would follow, flowed from that single strip of compacted coral and sand. In June of 1943, the Joint Chiefs of Staff formally directed Admiral Nimitz to execute an offensive against the Gilbert Islands. The operation was given the code name Galvanic. The target date was eventually set for the 15th of November, later pushed to the 20th, and the scope of the operation was ambitious by any standard. Approximately 200 ships would be assembled. More than 35,000 soldiers and Marines would be committed to the assault. The attack would strike simultaneously at 3 atolls: Tarawa, Makin, and Apamama. Tarawa was the hardest target. Everyone who looked at the intelligence knew that. The island of Betio had been occupied by Japanese forces since late 1941, and in the nearly 2 years since then, the garrison had not been idle. They had been building. The planning for Galvanic was an exercise in managing uncertainty at nearly every level. American intelligence about Betio's defenses was incomplete, gathered from aerial photography that could show the outlines of fortifications, but could not fully reveal their depth or construction quality. The tide tables for Tarawa's lagoon were drawn from pre-war surveys that were already decades old and of questionable reliability. Communication between the various components of the assault force, the ships, the landing craft, the shore parties, would depend on equipment that had never been tested at this scale of operation. Every one of these gaps would prove costly. But in the autumn of 1943, with the weight of a global war pressing down on every decision, the planners at Pearl Harbor pressed forward. The plan was imperfect, the need was not, and so the ships were loaded, the orders were cut, and the 2nd Marine Division began preparing for the hardest 76 hours of their lives. What is worth pausing on, even briefly, is the human texture of that preparation. These were not abstract forces moving on a map. They were men, most of them young, many of them barely past their teens, who had been pulled from farms and factories and colleges and city neighborhoods and placed inside a vast military machine that was now pointing them at a coral island most of them could not have. Found on a globe a year before, they had trained hard. They had trained for months, running amphibious exercises in the water and practicing the movements that would carry them from ship to shore. They believed in what they were doing. They had to. But none of the training, not a single exercise, had fully prepared them for what Betio was about to show them, about the difference between rehearsal and reality. That difference would be measured, in the end, in blood. The broader Pacific context in the autumn of 1943 was one of grinding, exhausting momentum. The United States had been fighting Japan for nearly 2 years. The early catastrophes, Pearl Harbor, the fall of the Philippines, the loss of Wake Island, had given way to a slow, painful reversal at Midway, then Guadalcanal, then a series of island battles in the Solomons that consumed men and ships and aircraft at a rate that no one had anticipated in peacetime. Guadalcanal alone, that 6-month campaign in the Southwest Pacific, had cost the Marine Corps casualties comparable to what would be suffered at Tarawa, but spread across half a year rather than 3 days. The Marines going into Galvanic knew what the war had already cost. They had seen the casualty lists. Some of them had fought at Guadalcanal. They were not naive about what lay ahead. But knowing the price of something intellectually is a different thing entirely from paying it. Betio was about to close that gap. There is one more element of this opening context that deserves attention before we move forward, and that is the element of overconfidence not on the Japanese side, not yet, but on the American side. The planning staff at Pearl Harbor believed, based on their assessment of the naval bombardment they intended to unleash on Betio in the hours before the landing, that the Japanese defenses would be substantially neutralized before the Marines touched the beach. The bombardment would be the heaviest ever directed at such a small area. Shells of 14-inch caliber and larger would fall on an island less than 300 acres in size. Surely, the reasoning went, nothing built of coral and coconut logs could survive that. Surely the garrison would be shattered, disoriented, unable to mount coherent resistance. Surely the landing would be, if not easy, then at least not catastrophic. That assumption layered into the planning and carried in the minds of commanders and riflemen alike would prove to be among the most consequential miscalculations of the Pacific War. The island and its defenders were far more prepared than anyone had reckoned. The Gilbert Islands had been under Japanese control since the dark early days of the war, seized in the same sweeping expansion that had carried Japanese forces across much of the Pacific and Southeast Asia in the months after Pearl Harbor. For the islanders who lived there, the Gilbertese, whose culture and communities predated any of this conflict by centuries, the occupation had been a disruption of everything familiar, an imposition of military authority over a way of life built around fishing and tides and community. Their presence in this story is often overlooked in the larger military narrative, but it is part of the full picture of what Tarawa was and what was lost and gained in the fighting there. The atoll had a human history long before either America or Japan had any stake in it. That history did not pause for the war. It absorbed the war, survived it, and continued. By the time the Great American Fleet began assembling in the autumn of 1943, the chain of choices and pressures and strategic necessities that would converge on Betio's lagoon shore had been building for months. The ships would come. The Marines would come. The tide, that capricious, unpredictable Apigean neap tide that would happen only twice in the entire year, was already forming in the deep water, preparing its own quiet, deadly contribution to the story. Nothing about what was coming could have been stopped by any individual act of will. The machine was in motion. The only question left was the cost of the destination. Chapter 2. The Fortress That Should Not Have Existed. There are fortresses in history that took decades to build. Medieval castles raised stone by stone over generations. Sea walls that required the labor of entire civilizations across centuries. Betio Island was not one of those. Betio was built in months. Between the early months of 1942 and the late autumn of 1943, a force of Japanese naval troops and Korean conscript laborers working in equatorial heat on a strip of coral barely wider than a city block, using materials scraped from the island itself, constructed what one observer would later describe as the most formidable small fortress in the world. They had no mountains to work with, no rivers or ravines for natural defensive lines. What they had was coral, coconut logs, sand, and the ruthless efficiency of a military engineering doctrine that took the limitations of the terrain and turned every one of them into an advantage. The man responsible for this fortification was Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, commander of the Japanese garrison on Betio and one of the most capable defensive engineers the Imperial Japanese Navy had placed in field command during the Pacific War. Shibasaki surveyed the island with the cold eye of a man who understood exactly what he was building and exactly what it would cost to take it. He positioned his fortifications not simply to repel an attack, but to create overlapping, interlocking fields of fire that would make every approach to the beach a corridor of death. Each pillbox and bunker was placed so that an attacker destroying one position would immediately be exposed to fire from 2 or 3 others. There was no angle of attack that Shibasaki had not considered. There was no direction from which an assault could come that he had not prepared for. When he surveyed his completed work, he told his officers with absolute confidence that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. It was not an idle boast. It was an engineer's assessment of his own work. The physical structure of those defenses was unlike anything American forces had yet encountered in the Pacific. The bunkers were built primarily from coconut logs, the natural timber of the island reinforced with coral fill and, in the most critical positions, steel plate salvaged from construction equipment and ship hulls. These were not improvised fighting holes. The main defensive positions had walls capable of stopping everything short of a direct hit from a heavy naval shell. Their roofs, some of them as much as 6 feet thick, layered with sand, logs, and corrugated iron, were designed to deflect rather than absorb incoming rounds. The firing ports were narrow, angled to minimize exposure while maximizing coverage. A defender inside one of these positions was effectively invisible and largely invulnerable to anything except precise, point-blank engagement. And there were approximately 500 of these positions on an island whose total area was less than 300 acres, 500 fortified positions, one for every half-acre of ground. The beach obstacles were an equally considered part of the defensive architecture. The reef that surrounded Betio, a broad, flat apron of coral extending as much as 550 yards seaward in places, was itself a natural barrier that Shibasaki had no need to construct. But he had augmented it with 3,000 contact mines laid in the shallow water, along with steel anti-boat obstacles, concrete tetrahedrons, and barbed wire strung between stakes in the shallows. Behind the beach, a coconut log seawall 3 to 5 feet high ran along much of the northern shoreline where the American landing was expected. This wall would prove to be simultaneously a killer and a lifeline, a barrier that stopped the tracked landing vehicles and channeled men into concentrated kill zones, but also, for the Marines who survived long enough to reach it, a few inches of cover in a world with no cover at all. The garrison itself was no ordinary occupying force. The core of Betio's defense was the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, the Rikusentai elite Japanese naval infantry who were among the most highly trained and deeply motivated troops Japan had fielded in the Pacific. They were not conscripts pressed into service. They were professionals who had been selected and trained for exactly this kind of defensive fighting. Their doctrine, their culture, their understanding of their own role in the war, all of it was oriented toward a single outcome. They would hold Betio or they would die on it. There was no middle option being considered. Alongside the Rikusentai, the garrison included additional naval construction troops, anti-aircraft crews, and the Korean laborers who had built the defenses, men whose presence at Tarawa was entirely involuntary and whose fate in the battle would be largely forgotten in the larger narrative. The total garrison numbered approximately 4,800 men. The weapons arrayed on this small island were formidable beyond what the island's size suggested. Coastal defense guns included pieces of 203mm caliber 8-inch guns capable of engaging ships far out at sea. There were also 4 guns of 140mm caliber anti-aircraft weapons running from 13mm to 37mm, and dozens of lighter weapons sighted to cover every approach. The machine gun count alone, 62 heavy and 44 light, meant that virtually no movement anywhere on or around the island could happen without coming under fire from multiple positions simultaneously. 3 light tanks supplemented the fixed defenses, providing mobile firepower in the event that attackers managed to break through the outer defensive line. And threading through all of it, connecting every position to every other, was a communication network that allowed Shibasaki to direct his defense with the precision of a conducted performance. What made the Betio defenses genuinely extraordinary beyond the numbers and the engineering was the depth of thought behind them. Shibasaki had studied amphibious assault doctrine. He understood that the most vulnerable moment for any attacking force was the transition from water to land, those seconds and minutes when men are in the open, wet, disoriented, and without cover. His entire defensive architecture was designed to maximize the killing power available during exactly that window. The beach itself was almost entirely exposed to fire from multiple angles. The seawall, while it offered a few inches of cover, sat in a zone covered by pre-registered machine gun fire from positions that could not be silenced from the water. Every choice Shibasaki made was oriented toward ensuring that the moment an American Marine stepped out of his landing craft and into that water, he would begin dying. The defenses were, in the most technical and dispassionate sense, masterfully designed. There is a certain grim professionalism in how Shibasaki organized his defense that deserves acknowledgement without any sentiment about the cause it served. The man was a serious military engineer confronting a serious military problem, and the solution he constructed was effective to a degree that would shock the American commanders directing the assault. The bunkers survived the heaviest pre-invasion naval bombardment the Pacific War had yet seen. The machine gun positions continued firing when the naval shells stopped. The garrison was not broken by the bombardment. They were rattled, perhaps some positions damaged. Some men disoriented by the concussion, but the fighting core of the defense emerged from that bombardment largely intact and fully prepared to do exactly what they had been trained to do. The confidence Shibasaki had expressed in his garrison was not the confidence of a man who had never seen combat. It was the confidence of a man who had built something he believed in. He was right about the fortress. He was wrong about the Marines. One detail that rarely gets the attention it deserves in accounts of Tarawa is the role of the Korean laborers in building Betio's defenses. These men, conscripted from their homeland under Japan's wartime labor policies, transported to an island they had never heard of, and put to work in tropical heat, building fortifications for a garrison they were not part of, had no stake in the outcome of the battle beyond their own survival. They dug the coral, hauled the coconut logs, laid the mines, strung the wire. When the battle came, they were caught inside the fortress they had built, alongside a garrison that did not regard them as soldiers and a military doctrine that had no provision for their survival. Of the more than 129 Korean laborers who survived the battle, their survival was largely a matter of accident and circumstance, rather than design by either side. Their presence at Tarawa and their fate is a reminder that the costs of any military operation are never confined only to the soldiers doing the fighting. By the time the American fleet appeared on the horizon in the pre-dawn darkness of the 20th of November, 1943, Betio was as ready as Shibasaki could make it. The guns were manned, the machine gun belts were loaded, the firing positions were occupied. The garrison had been living with the expectation of an American attack for months. Intelligence and common sense had told them it was coming, and the waiting had only sharpened their preparedness. Some accounts describe a peculiar calm on the island in those final hours before contact, the stillness of men who have made their peace with what is coming and have nothing left to do but wait for it. Whether or not that is strictly accurate, it captures something true about the psychological state of a garrison that had decided its outcome in advance. They would not surrender. They had built their fortress to hold forever. The Americans, they were certain, would break against it. The next 76 hours would prove them wrong about nearly everything except the willingness to die. Chapter 3. The Plan and the Planners. Planning an amphibious assault of the scale that Operation Galvanic represented was, in the autumn of 1943, an act of organized improvisation. The American military had been conducting amphibious operations for barely 2 years. The doctrine was new, the equipment was new, or in many cases, new enough that its limitations were not yet fully understood. The men who were supposed to coordinate the movement of hundreds of ships and thousands of troops across thousands of miles of open ocean and land them on a specific beach at a specific time were working with tools and experience that were, by the demanding standards of what they were being asked to do, still being developed. The plan for Galvanic was not reckless. It was, by the standards of its time, thorough and professionally executed. But thoroughness and professional execution could not fully compensate for the things that weren't known, the things that couldn't be known until the first waves were already in the water. The command structure for Galvanic was layered in the way that large joint operations are always layered, with all the communication complexity and potential for misunderstanding that layering involves. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the 5th Fleet, which would provide the naval muscle for the entire operation. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the overall assault forces. Major General Holland Smith of the Marine Corps commanded the newly formed 5th Amphibious Corps. For the Tarawa specifically, Rear Admiral Harry Hill commanded the Southern Attack Force, designated Task Force 53, and Major General Julian C. Smith commanded the 2nd Marine Division, which would carry out the actual landing. Below Smith, the regiments and battalions were led by officers who had varying degrees of amphibious assault experience, some veterans of Guadalcanal, some encountering this kind of combat for the first time. The command chain was sound on paper. In practice, as events would demonstrate, it would be under enormous strain almost from the first minutes of the operation. The tactical plan for the Betio landing designated 3 assault beaches along the northern lagoon-side shoreline of the island. These were designated Red Beach 1, Red Beach 2, and Red Beach 3, running from west to east across the northern face of Betio. A 4th potential landing area, designated Green Beach on the island's western tip, was held in reserve. The decision to land on the lagoon side rather than the ocean side was driven by the reef. The open ocean side of Betio faced a reef that was too shallow and too exposed to surf for landing craft to negotiate. The lagoon side, while still presenting a reef, was protected from the open ocean swells and offered a more controlled approach, at least in theory. The theory was correct, so far as it went. What it didn't account for was the tide that would not come. The landing craft were central to every calculation in the plan. The assault would use 2 primary types. The first were landing vehicles tracked LVTs, or Amtrak's amphibious tractors that could cross a reef under their own power, swim to the beach, and crawl up onto the sand on their tracks. These would carry the first 3 assault waves directly to the beach regardless of water depth. The second type were the conventional Higgins boats, LCVPs, which required a minimum water depth to clear the reef. The plan called for the tide to provide that depth. Pre-assault calculations, based on the aging tide charts available to the planners, estimated that by the time the later waves were approaching, water over the reef would be deep enough for the Higgins boats to pass. It was a reasonable estimate. It was also, as it would turn out, wrong in a way that no one in the planning process had been able to foresee. There was a specific meteorological phenomenon at work on the 20th of November, 1943, that the planners had no reliable way to predict. An apogean neap tide, a rare combination of the moon's position at its greatest distance from Earth and the transition between tidal phases, produces an abnormally low tide that can persist for many hours beyond the normal tidal cycle. This phenomenon occurred only twice in 1943, the entire year, twice. And one of those occurrences fell on the morning of the 20th of November, the morning of D-Day at Betio. The tide that was supposed to rise 3 to 4 feet above the reef barely moved at all. For the next 30 hours, the water over the reef stayed at a depth that stopped every Higgins boat dead, stranding the men inside them 500 yards from the beach, in water chest deep or deeper, with nowhere to go but forward. It was a coincidence of astronomical timing so cruelly precise that it would have been incredible if it had not been real. The pre-invasion bombardment that preceded the landing was planned to be overwhelming. The battleships Maryland, Colorado, and Tennessee, heavy warships of enormous firepower, along with cruisers and destroyers, would pound Betio for hours before the first Marines went ashore. The planners genuinely believed this bombardment would neutralize the majority of the island's defensive positions. This belief was not baseless. The concentration of heavy fire being directed at such a small area was extraordinary by any measure. What the planners did not fully appreciate was the construction quality of Shibasaki's bunkers. The coral and coconut log construction, counterintuitively, was in many respects more resilient to naval shell fire than conventional concrete. It absorbed and deflected energy that concrete would have transmitted. Heavy shells could destroy a position with a direct hit, but the near misses that would have cracked and shattered concrete instead scattered coral fill and left the structural integrity of the bunker largely intact. The bombardment was not wasted. It damaged many positions, disrupted communications, and disoriented portions of the garrison, but it did not kill the defense. The machine guns were still manned when the firing stopped. Colonel David Monroe Shoup was the officer who would bear the most direct personal responsibility for what happened on the beach. Once the first waves went in, a responsibility he neither sought nor avoided. Shoup was a 38-year-old Marine from Indiana, an officer who had come up through the Corps during the interwar years when the Marine Corps was small, underfunded, and largely overlooked by the broader American military establishment. He was not a glamorous figure. He was not the kind of officer who attracted attention in peacetime. What he was, and what Tarawa would expose in the most unsparing possible circumstances, was a leader of extraordinary steadiness, the kind of man who becomes more effective, not less, as the situation around him deteriorates. At Tarawa, Shoop would be wounded almost immediately upon landing, his leg hit by shrapnel, his neck grazed by a round. He would refuse evacuation. He would stay at the seawall for 2 days, directing the fight, organizing broken units, sending messages back to the command ship that were models of controlled precision under impossible pressure. He would receive the Medal of Honor for it. None of that, however, was apparent in the pre-dawn hours of the 20th of November, when he was just another colonel aboard a transport ship waiting for the order to move. The intelligence picture that the planners worked from was, as noted, incomplete. They knew there was a significant garrison. They knew there were fortifications. They estimated the garrison at somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500 combat troops, a figure that would prove to be roughly half the actual number. The difference between 2,000 defenders and nearly 5,000 is not a quantitative gap, it is a qualitative one. It changes the density of fire that defenders can bring to bear. It changes the number of positions that must be cleared. It changes the ratio between attacking and defending forces in every sector of the fight. The planners had done what they could with what they had. What they had was not enough to reveal the full depth of what they were sending the Marines into. One aspect of the planning that deserves more attention than it typically receives is the communication architecture, or rather, the fragility of it. The assault commander on the beach was supposed to be in continuous contact with the ships offshore, where the reserve battalions and the senior commanders were waiting for situation reports before committing additional forces. But the radios of 1943, submerged in salt water during the wade ashore, dropped in the chaos of the landing. Exposed to enemy fire on the beach, those radios were not reliable instruments. When Shoop reached the seawall and tried to communicate the state of the landing to the ships offshore, his reports were fragmentary, delayed, or simply not received. The ships, listening to silence or garbled transmissions, could not distinguish between a landing that was struggling but viable and a landing that was on the edge of catastrophe. The reserve sat offshore while the men on the beach held on. Every minute of that delay had a cost. The plan, in its broadest outline, was this: hit the beach hard and fast, overwhelm the garrison with the shock of the landing and the weight of the bombardment's effects, push across the narrow island to the southern shore, and secure the airfield. Optimistic estimates projected the island secured within a day, perhaps 2. The actual fight would take 3 days and cost more casualties in that time than the Guadalcanal campaign had cost in 6 months. The gap between the plan and the reality was not a gap in courage or commitment. The Marines who went into those waters were as brave and as motivated as any fighting force of the 20th century. The gap was between the information available to the planners and the full, brutal reality of what Shibasaki had built on that island. Filling that gap, paying the cost of that gap, fell entirely on the men in the water. Chapter 4. The Morning the Tide Did Not Come. 0445 hours, the 20th of November, 1943. In the darkness before dawn, the great guns of the American fleet opened fire on Betio Island, and the sound of it, the rolling, concussive thunder of battleship main batteries, firing at a target 2 miles across, carried across the water like something geological rather than mechanical. Men on the transport ships, miles back from the firing line, described feeling the concussion in their chests before they heard the report. The shells were visible as they arced toward the island, long orange streaks in the darkness, trajectories that looked almost lazy at that distance, before the flash and the roar of the impacts made the island look, briefly, like a volcano. The men watching from the transports, the men who would be going into those beaches in a matter of hours, told themselves that nothing could survive that. After what they were watching, surely the island would be a ruin and the garrison a ghost. In the lagoon, the tide was not moving as expected. The water over the reef, that critical depth measurement that the entire second, third, and fourth wave plan depended on, was not rising toward the 3 to 4 feet above the coral that the tide charts had promised. It was barely moving at all. The Apogean neap tide, that rare astronomical convergence occurring only twice in the year, had settled over Tarawa's lagoon like a held breath. The reef, barely covered, glistened in the early light. The Amtraks of the first 3 waves, the tracked vehicles that could cross the reef regardless of water depth, were already circling in their assembly areas, waiting for the signal to go in. But the Higgins boats behind them, loaded with the follow-on waves that would either consolidate the beachhead or reinforce a collapsing one, those boats were already in trouble before a single shot had been fired at them. The water simply was not there. The choice that no one had planned to face was already forming: wait for a tide that might not come, or send men into chest-deep water across 500 yards of open reef under fire. The bombardment ran for 2 hours and then stopped abruptly, earlier than many of the Marines had expected or wanted. The cessation had been driven by air support coordination requirements. An airstrike was supposed to come in immediately after the naval fire lifted, maintaining the pressure on the defences during the gap before the first wave touched the beach. But there was a delay in the air coordination. The planes were late. There was a gap, a period of perhaps 30 minutes, perhaps longer, during which the island lay still and the garrison, shaken but not broken, gathered itself. When the airstrikes finally came, they were compressed, hurried, less effective than planned. And when the naval fire and the airstrikes both ended, the machine gun positions on Betio began to come back to life, with a speed that told experienced observers everything they needed to know about the quality of the construction that had sheltered them. H-hour, the scheduled time for the first wave to touch the beach, was set for 8:30 in the morning. The first wave, in their Amtraks, was late. The timing had slipped in the complex choreography of circling assembly areas and coordinating with the fire support schedule. The first Marines did not actually reach the beach until close to 9:15. Those 45 minutes, while not decisive in themselves, contributed to the tightening of the already compressed window before the follow-on Higgins boats would begin to stack up on the reef. In the larger picture of what was about to happen, those minutes were part of the slow accumulation of small failures that no single planner had caused, but that the operation was now carrying collectively, like weight added one piece at a time until the load becomes crushing. The Amtraks of the first wave crossed the reef and entered the fire almost immediately. The Japanese defenders on the beach and in the machine gun positions behind the seawall had survived the bombardment in sufficient numbers to bring coordinated fire down on the approaching vehicles from multiple angles. The Amtraks were not armoured in the conventional sense. They were aluminum-hulled personnel carriers with enough protection to stop small arms fire, but vulnerable to heavier weapons. Machine gun fire punched through their sides. Heavier weapons destroyed some of them outright. The men inside those vehicles experienced the transition from the relative shelter of the Amtrak hull to the killing ground of the beach, with a violence and immediacy that no amount of training had prepared them for. Some of the vehicles were stopped at the seawall. Some were stopped in the water, short of the beach. Some made it to the sand, and the men poured out into the only cover available, the 3 to 5 foot coconut log barrier that lined the shore, which offered a few inches of protection against direct fire, while doing nothing to stop the mortar rounds and grenades that began falling almost immediately. Behind the first 3 waves, the Higgins boats of the follow-on waves reached the edge of the reef and stopped. The water depth was impossible. Not difficult, not challenging. Impossible shallow enough that a landing craft vehicle personnel, drawing more than 3 feet, could not pass without grounding hard on coral. The men inside those boats, hundreds of them, then thousands, faced a choice that was not really a choice at all. They could wait on the reef and be destroyed where they sat, or they could go over the side and wade. They went over the side, into chest-deep water, in some places neck-deep, carrying rifles and packs and ammunition that together weighed around 70 pounds in the air and considerably more when soaked. 500 yards to the beach, 500 yards of open water with no cover, while machine guns swept the lagoon in long, patient arcs. What happened in that water is the central image of Tarawa, the image that would appear in the newspapers back home, in the photographs that the American government would initially suppress and then, under pressure from the press and the public, reluctantly release. Men walking through water, hunched against fire that they could not see the source of and could not return. Men falling and not getting up. Men stepping around the men who had fallen and continuing forward because there was no other direction. The accounts of survivors describe a peculiar and terrible suspension of time during that wade, each step forward feeling both insignificant against the distance remaining and enormous against the weight of what was falling around them. Robert Sherrod, a Time magazine correspondent who waded ashore with the Marines, described a feeling not of fear, but of a strange, exhausted helplessness, the body moving forward because it was the only thing it could do, while the mind registered each death around him with a clarity that would not fade for decades. Red Beach 1, on the western end of the designated landing zone, absorbed some of the fiercest fire of the entire assault. It sat directly opposite the strongest concentration of Japanese defensive positions, where Shibasaki had placed his heaviest firepower. The battalion assigned to Red Beach 1, the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Schotel, encountered resistance so immediate and so concentrated that within the first hour of the landing, Schotel radioed back to the command ship with a message that captured the situation with stark precision. The message said, in effect, that the situation was in doubt, not that it was difficult, not that it was challenging. In doubt. It was the military's language for the possibility that the landing at that beach might not succeed at all. The message went back up the chain of command, from the beach to the transport ship, from the transport ship toward the senior commanders, and met the silence of broken radios and overwhelmed communications nets that would make every decision about committing the reserves agonizingly slow. The men who made it to the seawall clung there. They could not advance into the fire coming from the positions inland. They could not retreat into the fire coming from the water. They held the seawall with whatever units had made it ashore, fragments of companies, elements of platoons, men from different units mixed together by the chaos of the landing into improvised fighting groups led by whoever was still alive and still willing to move. Officers who had been designated to lead specific assaults found themselves instead trying to establish basic perimeters and account for who was still capable of fighting. The carefully planned assault had become, within the first hours of D-Day, something much more primal, a fight not for objectives but for existence, not for the airfield but for the seawall. The morning of the 20th of November, 1943, did not go as planned. That statement is so understated as to be almost meaningless, but it is where the story of Tarawa truly begins, not in the planning rooms at Pearl Harbor, not in the broad sweep of Pacific strategy, but in the water, on that reef, in that impossible tide that did not come, in the faces of the men who went over the side of their boats and started walking. What those men did in the hours and days that followed, the choices they made, the positions they took, the lives they spent and the lives they saved is a story that deserves to be told with the precision and respect it has earned. Chapter 5. The Men in the Water. There is a kind of courage that has no dramatic frame around it. It is not the courage of a charge or a speech or a moment of decision. It is the courage of the next step of putting one foot in front of the other when every surrounding circumstance is telling you to stop. The men wading across the reef at Tarawa on the morning of the 20th of November, 1943, were exercising exactly that kind of courage. And they were exercising it in water that was turning a color that nobody talks about when they talk about the Pacific Ocean. They were carrying 70 pounds of equipment in chest-deep water across 500 yards of open reef while machine gun fire swept the lagoon in the same patient. Mechanical arcs that had been killing since the guns first opened up. There were no individual acts of heroism here, in the conventional sense. There was only the collective, grinding, anonymous act of continuing to move forward. The scale of the carnage in those first hours is difficult to convey without it collapsing into abstraction. Numbers stop meaning anything after a certain point. What makes the numbers real is the specificity of individual experience, the fragment of story that stands in for the larger disaster. Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, the unit that would suffer the highest casualties of any single company in the engagement, lost 62 men killed over the course of the battle, including 5 of its officers. That number 62 represents a catastrophic degradation of a unit that would have entered the water with well under 200 men. It means that in those 76 hours, more than 1 in 3 of every man in that company died. That fraction, 1 in 3, is not abstract when you understand that these were men who had trained together, eaten together, slept in adjacent bunks on transport ships for weeks. 1 in 3 of every face you knew. First Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins was not supposed to be in the middle of the assault. His unit, a scout sniper platoon of 34 men, was specialized, trained for long-range reconnaissance and precision fire. In the months before Tarawa, senior commanders in Washington had actually debated whether scout sniper platoons had any useful role in Pacific Island warfare, where engagement ranges were measured in yards rather than hundreds of meters. The debate was not resolved before Galvanic was launched. What resolved it was Hawkins himself on the morning of the 20th of November at Battle Pier. The pier jutted out from the northern shore of the island into the lagoon, a long structure of coconut logs and coral fill that the Japanese had turned into a fortified obstacle, with positions on its length that could deliver flanking fire down the entire beach. The pier had to be cleared before the landing could consolidate. Hawkins took his 34 men down it. They moved from position to position with grenades and demolitions, clearing each fortified point under direct fire from positions they could not always see clearly. Hawkins was wounded during this action, shot in the chest, and refused evacuation. He continued fighting. He was killed the following day by artillery fire. The airfield on Betio was later named Hawkins Field in his honor. The scout sniper platoons were not disbanded. The situation on the 3 red beaches by mid-morning of D-Day was, by any honest assessment, critical. On Red Beach 1, the western beach where the resistance was heaviest, the landing had essentially stalled. The units that had made it ashore were pinned behind the seawall, taking casualties from mortar fire and unable to advance. The battalion commander, Chotel, was still offshore in a landing craft, unable to reach the beach through the fire, and communicating back to the command ship in the language of controlled desperation. His message, the "issue is in doubt," transmission was one of the clearest and most honest battlefield reports of the entire Pacific War, and one of the most chilling. It acknowledged what the plan had not accounted for, that the first day at Red Beach, one might end without a consolidated beachhead. On Red Beach 2 and Red Beach 3, the situation was marginally better, though marginally carries enormous weight in that context. Units had reached the seawall in larger numbers. Colonel Shoup himself had waded ashore, been wounded in the leg by shrapnel almost immediately, and established a command post of sorts behind the seawall, a position that was itself under fire but that was, crucially, on the island rather than in the water. From that position, in the chaos of D-Day morning, Shoup began doing what good commanders do in bad situations. He identified what he had, figured out what it could do, and started moving the pieces. He had fragments of multiple units, many without their original officers. He had a communications setup that was working intermittently at best. He had a seawall that was cover, but not a position you could shelter behind it, but not hold it as a defensive line forever. And he had the Japanese, less than 50 yards away, in positions that had survived the bombardment and were fully manned. The stories of individual Marines from that first day at the seawall are not easily separated from the larger narrative, because the narrative is made of them. They are not footnotes. They are the text. Staff Sergeant William James Bordelon of San Antonio, Texas, landed under fire and immediately began attacking fortified positions that were pinning his unit behind the seawall. He was wounded repeatedly in the course of his assault and continued fighting, destroying multiple defensive positions before being killed. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His story, and Hawkins' story, and Shoup's story are not exceptional because the men were exceptional in some abstract sense. They are exceptional because in circumstances that would have broken most human beings, these men continued to function, continued to think, continued to lead, continued to act with a clarity and purpose that seems, at this distance, almost impossible to explain without reference to something deeper than training or duty. The Japanese defenders on the other side of the seawall were, it must be said, fighting with an equally absolute commitment. They had made their choice before the battle started. Their defensive doctrine, their understanding of what honor and duty required, left them with no concept of withdrawal and no ability to contemplate surrender. They fought from their positions until those positions were destroyed from close range. Then they fought from the rubble of those positions until they had nothing left to fight with. The losses they inflicted on the Marines were enormous. The losses they suffered themselves were total. By the end of the 76 hours, of a garrison of nearly 5,000 men, 17 soldiers were taken prisoner. 17. The rest died where they fought. That figure, 17 out of 5,000, is not a military statistic. It is a statement about a culture of war that has no parallel in modern Western military history. By the afternoon of D-Day, the beachhead on Betio was real but precarious. Marines held portions of all three red beaches, narrow strips of sand behind the seawall, measured in yards rather than acres. Casualties were already severe. Many of the units that had gone ashore in the first waves were at a fraction of their effective strength. Communication between the beach and the command ship offshore remained difficult. The reserves, the 6th Marines, fresh and ready, were still sitting in their landing craft offshore, waiting for the situation ashore to clarify enough for the command to commit them. That clarity was slow in coming. Every hour the reserves waited was an hour the men on the beach held their thin strip of sand with what they had, under fire, without resupply, organizing themselves and the dead around them into something that could survive the night. What the survivors on that beach experienced as the sun began to lower toward the western horizon was a particular kind of exhaustion, not the exhaustion of physical effort alone, but the exhaustion of sustained fear, of continuous exposure to random death, of holding a position where the next moment might be the last, without any way to influence the probability. Correspondent Sherrod, who survived the landing and spent the first day at the seawall, described the psychological texture of that afternoon as something that did not fit inside the normal categories of experience. Not fear in the conventional sense, not courage in the conventional sense, but a kind of total absorption in the immediate that left no room for anything else. Time behaved differently on that beach. The sun seemed to move too slowly. The fire never stopped. The island smelled of burning and salt and something else that everyone who was there would carry in their memory forever. The night of the 20th of November, 1943, the first night on Betio, was its own particular test. The Marines on the beach could not advance in darkness across ground they had not reconnoitred and against positions they had not mapped. They held what they had and prepared for what doctrine told them was coming. Japanese counterattacks in the darkness, which the garrison's military culture made not just possible but probable. The men who had survived the wade and the seawall and the afternoon dug in as best they could in the coral and the sand and waited for the night to do what the night would do. Sleep was not a possibility. Rest was barely a concept. What remained was the discipline to stay in position, to hold the line, and to be ready when the Japanese came. And the Japanese would come. Chapter 6. Fire in the Dark. Night on Betio was not quiet. It was never quiet. From the moment the sun went down on the 20th of November until the sky began to lighten toward dawn, the island was alive with the sounds of a battle that was continuing in the darkness with no pause and no mercy. The Marines on the beach could not see clearly beyond the perimeter they had established. They could hear movement in the darkness on the Japanese side of the wire and the seawall. They could hear voices, occasionally orders being issued, coordinates being called, the logistical communications of a garrison preparing for the counterattacks that their doctrine required them to mount. And they could hear, with each passing hour, the question forming in the minds of everyone on that beach: when would it come? Japanese military doctrine in the Pacific War was, in many respects, built around the principle of the night counterattack. The logic was straightforward. In daylight, American firepower, naval gunfire, air support. The weight of automatic weapons and artillery that the United States could bring to bear created a dominance that Japanese forces could not overcome through frontal assault. But at night, that equation shifted. Naval gunfire was less precise. Air support was largely impossible. The darkness compressed distances and confused defensive fires. A night counterattack, if it struck at the right moment against a disorganized or exhausted enemy, could collapse a beachhead that had taken all day to establish. The Japanese garrison at Betio understood this. They had planned for it. And in the hours after dark on the 20th of November, elements of the garrison began probing the marine perimeter, testing its edges, looking for the weak points that a concentrated night attack could exploit. What they found was a marine force that was exhausted, under strength, and badly hurt but not broken. The men on the beach had used the afternoon hours, in between the continuing fire, to reorganize. Mixed units had been sorted out as much as possible. Ammunition had been redistributed. Machine gun positions had been established to cover the most likely approaches. Shoup, still at the seawall with his shrapnel wound, had been directing this reorganization with the methodical steadiness that would eventually earn him the highest military decoration his country could give. The perimeter was thin. In places, it was frighteningly thin. But it was a perimeter, and it was manned by men who understood, at a level below conscious thought, that the only way off Betio was forward through the Japanese lines or backward into the ocean, and that backward was not an option they were prepared to consider. The first night counterattacks came in company and platoon strength probes designed to find gaps and exploit them rather than all-out assaults aimed at overrunning the entire beachhead. The Japanese infantry that came out of the darkness moved with the discipline of highly trained troops who had been told exactly what to do and had no intention of doing anything else. They came in the darkness, at angles that avoided the most obvious fields of fire in the sudden rushes that their training prescribed. The Marines met them with machine gun fire, rifle fire, and at close quarters the hand-to-hand tools of close combat. The noise of these engagements, short, violent, conclusive in one direction or the other, punctuated the night at irregular intervals, keeping every Marine on the beach awake and coiled. Sleep was physiologically impossible and tactically dangerous. The men held on. By around 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 21st of November, a more significant counterattack developed on the eastern portion of the marine perimeter. Approximately 300 Japanese troops advanced against a section of the line held by understrength marine elements, and for a period of time that the survivors describe as simultaneously very long and very short. The fight was at its most desperate. Bodies pressed against bodies, fire coming from close enough that muzzle blast was a separate weapon. The Marines held. They held with machine guns that had been carefully positioned to cover exactly this approach, with flamethrowers that cleared positions that rifles could not reach, with an absolute refusal to yield ground that had already been paid for at such enormous cost that day. When the counterattack was broken, the ground in front of the Marine positions was covered with the evidence of what had happened there, and the Marines who had held the line did not celebrate. They reloaded. They checked their ammunition. They waited for the next one, because there was always a next one at Tarawa. The night was not over, and nobody with any experience of Japanese military doctrine believed it would end with a single attempt. The garrison still had men. The garrison still had purpose. And the garrison, whatever its losses in the first day of fighting, had not yet exhausted either. The other dimension of that first night was logistics, the grinding, unglamorous problem of keeping the men on the beach supplied with the basic materials of survival. Ammunition was the most urgent concern. The Higgins boats that had been stopped at the reef during the day had, in some cases, managed to transfer supplies to the Amtraks, which could cross to the beach. But the process was slow, dangerous, and incomplete. Men were rationing ammunition, machine gun crews were counting belts, riflemen were carrying rounds stripped from the dead. The dead, by the end of the first day, were present in numbers that made this a practically relevant rather than a morbid consideration. Betio's beach, in those first hours, was a place where the resources of the dead were the operational necessity of the living. Dawn on the 21st of November, the second day arrived with the particular cruelty that dawn has in combat, which is that it reveals what the darkness had mercifully obscured. The beach in the morning light looked nothing like the clean geometric diagrams on the planner's maps. It looked like what it was, a narrow strip of sand at the base of a seawall that had been fought over with everything that men and weapons could deliver across more than 12 hours of continuous engagement. The wounded who had not been evacuated, and there were many who had not been evacuated, because evacuation required the same transit across the reef that had been killing men since the previous morning, were lying in whatever shelter the seawall and the terrain provided. The dead lay where they had fallen. There was no time and no capacity to move them. It was on the morning of the second day that the decision to commit the reserves was finally forced by the weight of the situation. The 6th Marines, the regiment held in reserve since the previous day, were ordered in. They had been waiting offshore in their landing craft for more than 18 hours, and the order to move gave them a clarity that the waiting had not provided. But the reef was still there. The tide, which had been the proximate cause of the first day's catastrophe, had not dramatically improved. The 6th Marines would also wade. Some of them would also die in the water, as the men before them had died. But they would reach the beach in sufficient numbers, and their arrival on the second day would change the arithmetic of the fight slowly, painfully, at continuing cost, but change it. The question that hung over the morning of the second day was not whether the Marines would eventually take the island. By the second morning, the men in command were sufficiently confident in the resilience of the beachhead that the outcome, while not certain, was clearly trending in one direction. The question was cost. How many more men would it take? How many more of those 500-yard wades? How much more time before the interlocking positions that Shibasaki's engineers had designed so carefully could be reduced one by one, position by position, with the close-range tools, the flamethrower, the demolition charge, the grenade, that were the only things that actually worked against a well-constructed bunker when naval fire could not be directed accurately enough to hit it without also hitting your own men? The answer to that question would not be known until the 76th hour. And the only way to get to the 76th hour was through every hour before it. What gave the Marines on Betio the ability to keep moving forward on the second and third days, to pick themselves up off the coral, to organize their fragments, to cross open ground toward positions that they knew were manned, and waiting is a question that military historians and psychologists have been examining since the battle ended. The training was part of it. The unit cohesion, that powerful social bond between men who have shared hardship together, was part of it. But there was also something else, something harder to name, that Tarawa brought out in a particularly concentrated way. It was the refusal to let the men beside you be the only ones moving. It was the unwillingness to be the one who stopped while others continued. It was not heroism in the abstract. It was loyalty in the specific loyalty to the man on your left and the man on your right, expressed in the only currency available on that beach. Chapter 6. Full completion. Fire in the dark. Continuing the final paragraphs to reach the full word target. The flamethrower was, in the fighting on Betio, the weapon that changed the tactical equation in a way that nothing else could match. Against the coconut log bunkers that had survived naval bombardment and resisted rifle and machine gun fire, the flamethrower, with its ability to project burning fuel through the narrow firing ports and into the interior of a position, was uniquely lethal. The men who carried them knew what they were carrying, in every sense. A flamethrower operator on Betio was among the most conspicuous and therefore most targeted figures on the battlefield. The weapon was heavy, cumbersome, and made its carrier into an obvious priority target for every Japanese rifleman and machine gunner who could draw a bead on the silhouette. The men who picked them up and carried them forward anyway did so understanding what it meant. The positions fell when the flamethrowers reached them. Getting the flamethrowers to the positions was the problem. Getting them there required everything else: the rifle fire, the grenade, the smoke, the covered movement that turns a tactical assault from an idea into an execution. Demolition teams worked alongside the flamethrower operators in the methodical reduction of Betio's defensive network. The technique, developed by improvisation on D-Day and refined through the subsequent fighting, involved suppressing a bunker with rifle and machine gun fire from multiple angles, moving a demolition team to close range under that suppression, placing charges at the base of the structure or in the ventilation openings, and then retreating to a safe distance before the charge fired. When it worked, and over the course of the 76 hours, it came to work with increasing reliability as the Marines developed the precise tactical choreography. The approach required the bunker cease to exist as a defensive position. When it didn't work, when the suppression was insufficient, when the demolition team was hit before it could place its charge, when the charge failed to detonate, the cost of the attempt was paid immediately and in full. By the end of the first night and the beginning of the second day, Shoop's command post behind the seawall had become a peculiar kind of nerve center for the battle. Men came to it with reports, with questions, with requests for direction when their own officers were down and the tactical situation was unclear. Shoop gave direction. He was in pain. The shrapnel wound in his leg was significant, not minor, and he was operating on no sleep, with communications that were still intermittent, in a situation that was better than the previous afternoon, but still far from resolved. What he communicated to the men who came to that command post, by his presence and his steadiness more than by any specific words, was the thing that leadership in extremis most essentially provides. The sense that someone is still thinking, still directing, still in command of something, even when almost everything else is out of control. That sense, fragile, constructed partly from will, was part of what held the beachhead through the night. The sound environment of that first night at Betio is worth dwelling on, because sound is what the men in the darkness had to navigate by. The visual information available to a Marine behind the seawall after dark was limited to muzzle flashes, the occasional illumination round from a ship offshore, and whatever the stars and the equatorial moon provided. But sound was everywhere and continuous: the crack of rifle fire, the longer tearing sound of machine guns, the crump of mortars landing, the sharp, flat report of grenades, the close-range sounds of the night counterattacks when they came. Experienced Marines could read the battle from the sound, could tell from the pattern of fire where the pressure was building and where it had eased, where a position was holding and where something was going wrong. The younger men, the ones for whom this was the first night of combat in their lives, were learning a language that no training could teach and that would be useful only here, on this island, in this fight, in a way that could not be transferred to any subsequent experience without the full weight of this context attached to it. The stars above Betio on the night of the 20th of November were visible with an equatorial clarity, no cloud cover. The Milky Way spread across the sky in the way it only appears at low latitudes, far from the light pollution of cities. This detail, the stars, appears in several survivor accounts of the night, not as beauty, but as a kind of cognitive dissonance. The sky above the island was exactly as it should have been. The world above the fighting was unchanged. The stars did not acknowledge what was happening beneath them on that narrow piece of coral. The universe had not paused for Betio. That realization, the sense of the indifference of the physical world to the extremity of human suffering, is one of the constants of combat experience that crosses cultures and centuries, and its presence in the accounts of the Tarawa survivors connects their experience to a very long human conversation about what war actually is. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten toward the dawn of the 21st, the second day, the men on the beach had been awake for more than 24 hours, had been under fire for most of that time, and had endured the night counterattacks with a combination of firepower, discipline, and the particular stubbornness that exhaustion sometimes produces in human beings when there is genuinely no alternative. The beachhead was intact. It was narrow, it was costly, it was still being fired on from multiple sides, but it was real. The Marines were on the island. They had paid a price that none of the planners had projected, and they would pay more in the hours ahead. But the first test surviving the night had been passed. What the second day would bring, and what the third would require, was still ahead of them, still forming in the positions and bunkers that the garrison held on the interior of the island. Rear Admiral Shibasaki had, by the end of the first day, lost communication with portions of his garrison. The bombardment and the landing had damaged portions of the communication network that linked his command to his defensive positions. His ability to direct the defense centrally, to coordinate counterattacks, to shift reserves, to respond to the marine penetrations with the orchestrated precision his plan required was diminishing. He was still alive, he was still in command, such as it was, but the control that his defensive architecture depended on was beginning to fray at the edges. The individual pillboxes and bunkers were continuing to fight their occupants, needed no direction for that. Their resolve required no external reinforcement. But the coordination that could have turned a defense into something more than isolated resistance was becoming harder to sustain. The battle was moving, inexorably and at terrible cost, toward its conclusion. Nobody on the island on that second morning could have told you when that conclusion would arrive, or precisely what form it would take. But the direction was becoming, to those who could see the whole picture, clear. The men who held the beachhead through that first night, and who would carry the fight forward through the second day and into the third, were in the aggregate, in their collective behavior across 76 hours, accomplishing something that had never been done before in quite this form. They were proving that a fortified position of this quality, held by defenders of this determination on terrain of this difficulty, could be taken by assault, not easily, not cheaply, not according to any plan that had been written before the landing, but it could be taken. That proof, earned at a cost that would take the American public weeks to process, and that the Marine Corps would carry as both a wound and a standard for generations, was the lasting military significance of Tarawa. Everything else that would happen in the Central Pacific, every subsequent amphibious assault that went more smoothly and cost less, was built in some part on what was proven and learned and paid for in those 76 hours on Betio. The tide had not come. The plan had fractured. The men had not. If you are still with us, thank you for watching. The story of Tarawa is not one you forget easily, and it should not be. If what you have heard tonight has meant something to you, if the names and the numbers and the details of what happened on that reef have settled into something you want to carry forward, please consider subscribing to this channel. There are 17 more chapters ahead of us in this story. The second day, the third day, the last stand of the garrison, the photographs that shook America, the lessons that changed the entire course of the Pacific War. We will cover every hour of it, with the care and the honesty it deserves. The men who were there left us the obligation of remembering accurately. We intend to honor it. Chapter 7, The Second Day, Grinding Forward. The 21st of November, 1943, began the way the previous day had ended, with fire. There was no clean break between the night and the morning on Betio. The darkness did not lift and take the fighting with it. The sun came up over the eastern end of the island and revealed a landscape that had been transformed, in less than 24 hours, from a fortified military installation into something that looked more like the surface of a different planet, cratered, burned, strewn with the wreckage of landing vehicles and the evidence of the night's counterattacks, every surface coated in the fine coral dust that the bombardment and the fighting had ground out of the island's substance. The Marines who emerged from their positions at the seawall and the improvised fighting holes they had scratched into the coral overnight did so with the particular deliberateness of men who had learned, in the hardest possible school, that movement drew fire and that every step in the open was a calculation. They were still alive. They were still on the island. That was the day's starting point, and from that starting point, they had to begin again. The central tactical problem on the morning of day 2 was the same problem it had been the previous afternoon, but now it had a clearer geography. The Marines held a beachhead along the northern shore of Betio, a strip of ground, in some places no more than 30 or 40 yards deep, running roughly along the line of the coconut log seawall. To the south of that line was the airfield, the reason for everything, the strategic justification for every death that had already occurred and every death that was still to come. Between the beachhead and the airfield was a belt of Japanese defensive positions, the pillboxes, the bunkers, the interconnected strongpoints that had survived the naval bombardment and the first day's fighting in numbers that were, for the men who had to reduce them, deeply discouraging. The Japanese were not going to abandon those positions. They were going to die in them. The Marines were going to have to kill them one position at a time, at close range, with the weapons that worked and the methods that worked, and accept the cost that this entailed. There was no shortcut. There was no clever maneuver that made this easier. There was only the next position, and the next, and the one after that. The arrival of reinforcements on the second day changed the arithmetic without transforming the conditions. The 6th Marines, the reserve regiment that had been sitting offshore in their landing craft for more than 18 hours, were committed to the battle on the morning of the 21st. They came across the reef as the earlier waves had come, some in the Amtraks that could cross under their own power, others wading through water that was still, on the western approaches, too shallow for the Higgins boats. The tide on the morning of the second day had improved somewhat from the catastrophic conditions of D-Day, but it had not improved enough to eliminate the reef as an obstacle. Men still waded. Men still fell in the water. But the numbers reaching the beach were higher, and the units arriving were fresher men who had not yet spent a night in coral fighting positions, men whose ammunition loads were intact, men who brought with them the simple, enormous resource of not yet being broken. Their arrival gave Shoup, still directing from his command post at the seawall, the capacity to think about offense rather than survival. The tactical approach on day 2 was more systematic than anything that had been possible on D-Day, when the fight had been shaped entirely by chaos and emergency. Marine officers had spent the night to whatever extent they could think through the noise and the counterattacks, identifying the positions that most urgently needed to be reduced, and planning the sequences in which flamethrower teams and demolition squads would approach them. The close-range assault technique that had been developed by improvisation the previous day was now something closer to a repeatable method. Suppress the position with fire from multiple angles, work a team to close range under that suppression, apply the flamethrower or the demolition charge, move to the next position. It was slow, it was expensive in the men who had to carry it out, but it worked. And on the second day, it began to move the line. Green Beach, on the western tip of Betio, was taken in the early hours of the 21st of November by elements of the 6th Marines who had come around the western end of the island rather than landing directly on the contested northern shore. The capture of Green Beach was significant, not primarily for the ground it represented. The western tip of the island was not where the main defensive strength was concentrated, but for what it allowed the battle to become. With a beachhead at Green Beach in addition to the red beaches on the north shore, the marine assault had positions on 2 sides of the western portion of the island. It was the beginning of the pincer movement that would, over the subsequent 24 to 36 hours, compress the Japanese defense into an ever-narrowing pocket on the eastern end of Betio. The island was small enough that even modest advances measured in dozens of yards changed the tactical geometry significantly. Every position taken tightened the noose. The airfield itself, that compacted coral strip that was the reason for the entire operation, was within reach of the marine positions by the afternoon of the second day. Reaching it and crossing it were 2 different things. The airfield's open ground offered no cover, and Japanese positions on its far side could cover the entire width of the runway with direct fire. Crossing the airfield required either the suppression of those positions or the acceptance that the men crossing would take casualties from them, or both. The Marines who crossed it on the afternoon of the 21st did so with the knowledge of both possibilities and the choice made before they stepped onto the open ground. The crossing succeeded not cleanly, not without loss, but successfully. The southern shore of Betio came into view for Marine units for the first time in the battle. The island was narrowing for the Japanese garrison. The ground available to the defenders was compressing. The end was still not close. It was not close in hours, and it was certainly not close in the cost it would still exact. But it was now visible in the distance, in the way that the far shore of a wide river is visible before you have entered the current. General Julian Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division from the command ship offshore, had spent the first day and most of the first night in the particular agony of a commander who cannot see his battle and cannot get reliable information about it. The communications from the beach had been intermittent, fragmentary, sometimes contradictory. The reports that reached him painted a picture that was alarming, without being precise. High casualties, stalled advances, uncertain situations on multiple beaches, messages that told him the fight was harder than expected, without fully conveying what harder than expected meant in terms of actual numbers and positions. On the morning of the second day, as communications improved slightly, and as the situation on the beach became marginally clearer, Smith was able to begin making more confident decisions about commitment of forces and direction of effort. The clarity was relative. The decisions were made under conditions of uncertainty that would have been professionally paralyzing for a less experienced commander. Smith was not paralyzed. He directed, he committed, he pushed. One of the less discussed dimensions of the second day at Tarawa is the medical situation. The wounded from D-Day and the first night had been accumulating in the limited shelter available behind the seawall and in the improvised aid stations that Navy corpsmen had established in shell craters and behind wrecked Amtraks. Evacuation back across the reef to the ships offshore remained extremely difficult. The same conditions that had made the morning of D-Day catastrophic for the landing waves made the process of moving wounded men in the opposite direction equally dangerous and slow. Corpsmen, Navy medical personnel attached to the Marine units worked continuously under fire, treating wounds in conditions that would have been unacceptable in a field hospital setting and that were the only conditions available. Their casualty rate was significant. Their contribution to the survival of wounded Marines who would otherwise have died from blood loss or shock was immeasurable. They are part of this story in a way that the purely military narrative does not always fully capture. By the evening of the second day, the Japanese garrison had been pushed into a contracting perimeter on the eastern portion of Betio. Rear Admiral Shibasaki was dead killed on the first day in circumstances that remain somewhat unclear in the historical record, likely during the naval bombardment or in the fighting near his command post. His death, leaving the garrison without centralized leadership at the precise moment when coordinated defense was most needed. The individual positions continued to fight with their accustomed ferocity. The death of the commander had not diminished the resolve of the individual defenders, but the coordination that centralized command provided, gone. What remained was a garrison fighting in fragments, each position defending itself until it was destroyed, with no larger operational direction and no possibility of anything except the end that every man in those positions had already accepted. The close of the second day brought the same exhausted vigilance that the close of the first had brought the same need to hold through another night, the same uncertainty about what the darkness would bring. But the shape of the second night was different from the first. The Marines held more ground, they held it with more men. Their lines of communication and supply, while still imperfect, were better than they had been 24 hours earlier. The Japanese, compressed and leaderless and diminished by 2 days of the most sustained and intensive close-range combat in the Pacific War to that point, they were capable still of fighting with lethal effect. They would demonstrate that through the night, but the weight of the battle had shifted, not decisively, not yet, but perceptibly, in the way that a balance shifts before anyone can see which way the plate will fall. The third day was coming. The third day would bring its own costs. But the third day, for the first time, carried the credible possibility of an ending. Chapter 8. Positions in the Coral. Understanding what it actually meant to reduce a Japanese defensive position on Betio to move from the seawall to the bunker to the next bunker, across ground that was both open and saturated with fire, requires sitting with a specificity that the larger strategic narrative tends to skip over in its movement from D-Day to D+3. The individual bunker fight was where the battle was actually won. Not in the planning rooms at Pearl Harbor, not in the naval bombardment that preceded the landing, not in the decisions made by generals on ships offshore. The battle was won by small groups of Marine infantrymen, fire teams, squads, ad hoc combinations of survivors working their way from one Japanese fighting position to the next across the narrow, burning coral of Betio, using techniques they had partly trained for and partly invented as the situation demanded. The scale of the battle was small, the geography was intimate, the violence was absolute. The construction of the typical Betio bunker is worth understanding in detail. because the construction determined the tactics, and the tactics determined the cost. The standard Japanese defensive position on the island was built around a core of coconut logs, heavy, dense tropical timber that absorbed and deflected rather than shattering under impact. The logs were laid in interlocking horizontal courses, typically 3 to 4 logs deep, creating walls that were more than a meter thick at their thinnest point and as much as 2 meters thick in the most heavily reinforced positions. Over the log walls, the builders had mounded coral fill excavated from the island's own substance in layers that could be 3 to 5 feet deep. The roof was built to similar standards, using the same log and fill construction designed to deflect incoming rounds downward rather than allowing them to penetrate. The result was a structure that could sustain near misses from naval shells of several hundred pounds and remained structurally intact, its occupants shaken but functional. Against this kind of construction, a rifle or a machine gun was largely a distraction. The only things that reliably worked were the flamethrower and the demolition charge, and getting either of those to within effective range required solving the problem of the firing ports. The firing ports on a well-built Betio bunker were narrow, angled slits typically no more than 8 to 10 inches high and perhaps 16 inches wide, cut at an angle into the log wall so that a defender inside could fire outward across a broad arc while presenting a target that was, from almost any angle of approach, nearly impossible to engage effectively with small arms fire. A well-aimed rifle round entering through a firing port was lethal and immediate, but hitting a narrow-angled slit from a moving position, under fire, at close range, required a precision that most riflemen could not consistently deliver in combat conditions. The scout sniper platoons, the specialized marksmen that headquarters had considered disbanding, had demonstrated on D-Day that trained precision shooters could hit those ports with sufficient consistency to suppress the defenders inside long enough for a flamethrower team to close the distance. That discovery, paid for in the fighting at the pier and along the seawall on the first day, became part of the tactical method that the Marines refined and applied across the second and third days. The demolition teams that worked alongside the flamethrowers on Betio were improvised in their composition but systematic in their method. A team typically included a man carrying the demolition charges, blocks of explosive wrapped in canvas or packaged in waterproofed containers, along with riflemen providing close-in, suppressive fire and, ideally, a smoke grenade to obscure the team's approach for the final few yards. The process was straightforward in concept and terrifying in execution. The team moved from cover to cover, closing on the position under the suppressive fire of their supporting element until the charge carrier was close enough to place the explosive at the base of the wall or in an opening. Then they ran. The charges were fused for a period that was long enough to allow the team to reach safety, but short enough that the defenders inside could not remove the charge before it detonated. When the charge went off, the structural integrity of the position was compromised sufficiently that it could no longer function as a fighting platform. The defenders who survived the initial blast were dealt with at close quarters. The team moved to the next position. The physical geography of Betio worked both for and against the Marines in these close-range fights. The island's narrow width, never more than about 800 yards from north to south, and in places barely 300 yards, meant that distances were compressed and the fighting was always intimate. A Marine clearing a bunker on the northern edge of the airfield could hear, and in some cases see, activity on the southern shore. There were no strategic depths to this battle. Every position was close to every other position. The advantage this gave the Marines was that captured ground was genuinely consolidated ground. There were no vast rear areas for remnant Japanese forces to infiltrate and attack from behind. The disadvantage was the same coin's other face. There was also no rear area for the Marines. Wounded men and fighting men occupied the same narrow strip of ground. Command posts were within small arms range of the active fighting line. The combat, for everyone on that island, was immediate and omnipresent in a way that larger, more dispersed battlefields do not produce. The tanks that were available to the Marines during the second and third days played a role that their small numbers, fewer than half a dozen, were operational at any given time during the fighting would not suggest. Light tanks, the M4 Shermans that had been loaded onto the transport ships, and then painstakingly transferred to landing craft for the assault, were initially hobbled by the same reef and seawall obstacles that had stopped everything else on D-Day. Several were drowned in deep water near the reef, their hatches open for crew ventilation, the water flooding in before the crews could escape. But those that made it to the beach and over the seawall became, in the close-range bunker fighting, a capability of disproportionate value able to bring direct fire against positions at point-blank range, able to absorb machine gun fire that would have killed a squad of infantry, able to support the flamethrower teams and demolition squads by providing the kind of close suppression that infantry weapons alone could not deliver with sufficient density. The men who fought alongside those tanks in the bunker clearing operations of the second and third days were clear in their assessments. Where tanks could be employed, the positions fell faster and at less cost. The Japanese defenders in those positions were, from all accounts and from the evidence of the fighting itself, fully committed to the end they had already accepted. There are no reliable accounts of Japanese soldiers in their bunkers at Betio considering surrender, attempting to negotiate, or looking for an alternative to the outcome their doctrine and their culture had prescribed. They fought from their positions until the positions were destroyed. They fought from the rubble of their positions when the structural integrity was gone. In some cases, when the position was clearly lost, they charged outward into the open ground not as retreat, not as a tactical maneuver, but as a final act of defiance that their code of conduct required and that their training had prepared them for. This was not irrationality in the context of what they believed and who they were. It was a coherent, deeply held response to the situation they were in. Understanding it does not require endorsing it. It requires acknowledging that the men on both sides of those firing ports were operating according to their own fully formed understanding of what their situation demanded of them. The medical reality of the close-range bunker fighting was one that the Navy's medical personnel on Betio managed under conditions that strained every resource and every skill they had. Penetrating wounds from rifle fire, blast injuries from grenades and demolition charges, burns from the secondary effects of flamethrower deployments at close quarters, the wound patterns of the Betio fighting were concentrated and severe. The Navy corpsmen attached to the Marine units were providing care in the open, under fire, with the medical supplies they had carried ashore and whatever they could improvise from the materials available on the beach. Blood volume replacement, the critical intervention for a large proportion of combat casualties, required plasma, which had to come across the reef in the same perilous Amtrak runs that brought ammunition and reinforcements. The survival rate of wounded Marines who reached medical care was, given the conditions, remarkably high, and that rate is directly attributable to the quality and the courage of the Navy corpsmen who provided that care. Their story at Tarawa runs parallel to the fighting story and is inseparable from it. One of the more telling details of the second-day fighting is how the units involved described it afterward. Not as heroism, in most accounts, not as triumph. They described it as work. Hard, ugly, necessary work. The language of Tarawa veterans in the oral histories, in the letters home that passed the military censors, in the accounts recorded years and decades after the event, is consistently the language of effort rather than the language of glory. They describe positions taken as problems solved. They describe casualties as costs paid. They describe the advance across the airfield and into the eastern half of the island with the same matter-of-fact vocabulary they might use to describe any difficult physical task completed under difficult conditions. This is not modesty performing as language. This is accuracy performing as language. What happened on Betio was work the most demanding and lethal kind, and the men who did it understood it that way. By the end of the second day, the eastern portion of Betio remained in Japanese hands, but the situation had changed fundamentally from what it had been at the end of D-Day. The Japanese garrison was no longer a force capable of coordinated defensive operations. It was a collection of isolated positions, each one still lethal, each one still manned by men who would fight until they were killed, but no longer connected into the interlocking defensive system that Shibasaki had designed, and that had made the first hours of the landing so catastrophic. The system that had been designed to hold 1 million men for 100 years had been broken in less than 48 hours. What remained was the cleanup, a word that sanitizes what the third day would actually look like and cost. But the shape of the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Marines had broken the fortress. The island would follow. Chapter 9. The Banzai and the Last Stand. The night between the 22nd and the 23rd of November, 1943, the second night on Betio, was the night of the last organized Japanese counterattack. It came at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, when the defenders in the eastern portion of the island gathered what remained of their coherent fighting strength and launched a charge against the Marine lines that was, in its scale and its ferocity, the single largest concentrated action the Japanese garrison undertook in the battle. The attack was not strategically motivated in the conventional sense. It was not designed to recapture the beaches or break the Marine perimeter in a way that would reverse the battle's outcome. The men who charged that night knew, as well as the Marines who faced them, that the outcome was no longer reversible. What drove the charge was not strategy but obligation, the obligation that their code, their culture, and their training required of them when the fight was lost, and the only question left was how the end would be met. The Marines facing that charge were in their fighting positions along the line they had established at the end of the second day's fighting. They were exhausted, a condition that by the second night had moved beyond what that word normally conveys, into a state of physical depletion so deep that it affected cognition, slowed reactions, and made the simple act of maintaining alertness a constant active effort. But they were in their positions, they were armed, and the warning of the coming attack had preceded it by enough time. Footsteps in the darkness, voices, the particular sounds of men gathering and preparing that experienced ears could read that the machine guns and automatic rifles were manned and oriented when the attack came. The attack crossed open ground that the defenders had pre-registered their weapons on. The result, in the cold arithmetic of firepower and exposure, was the destruction of the attacking force. Bodies covered the ground in front of the Marine positions when the light came up. The number of Japanese killed in that final counterattack was among the highest of any single engagement in the three-day battle. The third day, the 23rd of November, was the day of the final accounting. The organized defense of Betio had been broken by the combination of the second night's Banzai charge and the Marine advance of the previous day. What remained on the eastern tip of the island and in the last surviving positions along the northern shore was a collection of isolated Japanese defenders, some of them still in bunkers, some in firing pits, some simply using whatever cover the debris of the battle provided, who had no ability to coordinate their resistance, but every intention of continuing it until they were killed. The Marine advance through the eastern portion of the island on the morning of the 23rd was methodical and total. No position was bypassed. No area was assumed to be clear without direct confirmation. The cost of the day's fighting was lower than the cost of the previous 2 days because the defending force was smaller and more degraded. But lower is a relative term on Betio. Men died on the 23rd. They died clearing the last positions of a garrison that had decided to die in them. The moment when organized resistance on Betio ceased, the moment that the battle, in its formal military sense, ended, came on the afternoon of the 23rd of November, 1943. Major General Julian Smith, from the command ship, received the report that the island was secured. He passed it up the chain of command. The official elapsed time from H-hour to the declaration of island secured was 76 hours. In those 76 hours, 1,009 Marines had been killed and 2,101 had been wounded. The Navy's losses added further to that accounting. Of the Japanese garrison of approximately 4,800 men, 4,690 were dead. 1717 soldiers had been taken prisoner. The remaining survivors were Korean laborers, whose survival was a matter of circumstance rather than any deliberate accommodation by either military. The numbers, laid out in that flat sequential way, do not fully convey what they represent, but they are the numbers, and they belong in the record. The physical state of Betio at the moment of its securing was a monument to what 76 hours of total war at close range does to a small piece of the earth. The island's vegetation, the coconut palms that had given the defensive construction its primary material, had been stripped by the bombardment and the fighting until what remained resembled, in the accounts of men who walked the island after the fighting stopped, the surface of a place that had been subjected to some kind of geological violence rather than a military one. The defensive positions that had been destroyed presented a particular visual quality. The heavy coconut logs split and scattered by demolition charges, the coral fill churned into dust that settled over everything. The steel and iron of the gun emplacements twisted into shapes that their original forms were no longer visible in. The beach, on which so much of the battle had been decided, was scattered with the wreckage of amtraks and landing craft and the debris of the fight's first day that the subsequent day's fighting had not cleared. It was a landscape that those who saw it carried in their minds for the rest of their lives. Of the 17 Japanese soldiers who were taken prisoner, most had survived by circumstances that differed significantly from the garrison's doctrine of last-stand resistance. Some had been wounded severely enough that they could not continue fighting and had lapsed into unconsciousness before the final hours of the battle. Some had been buried under the rubble of destroyed positions and had survived without the ability to choose their end. The military and cultural framework of the Japanese imperial forces was, in its treatment of prisoners, extremely clear. Surrender was a form of dishonor so complete that it negated the life that preceded it. The 17 men who survived did not, for the most part, choose surrender in any conventional sense. They survived in the margins of the battle's end, in spaces where the choice had been made for them by circumstance. The contrast between their survival and the deaths of nearly 5,000 of their comrades is one of the most striking statistical facts of the entire Pacific War, a single engagement with a casualty rate among the defenders of approximately 99.6%. The banzai charge of the second night deserves more than the tactical summary it typically receives. It was, in a sense, the last coherent act of the garrison as a military unit, a final expression of the values and the obligations that had shaped every decision the defenders had made. From the moment the American ships appeared on the horizon, the men who participated in that charge were not acting irrationally by the standards of the culture and the code they had been formed by. They were acting in the most precise accordance with those standards. They had defended their position. They had inflicted maximum casualties on the attacker. They had not yielded ground that they could hold. When the ground became impossible to hold, they chose the ending that their code prescribed. The charge, and the deaths that resulted from it, were the final chapter of Shibasaki's garrison, written in the only language its members understood. Understanding that does not change what it cost. It changes only how clearly the cost is seen. The Marines who survived to walk the island in the hours after the fighting stopped did so in a silence that was, after 76 hours of continuous noise, almost physically startling. The guns had stopped. The grenades had stopped. The mortar rounds had stopped. The island was quiet in a way that it had not been since before the first naval shells fell in the pre-dawn darkness of the 20th of November. That silence was not peaceful. It was weighted with everything that had happened in the preceding 3 days, weighted with the dead, who were present in numbers that would require days to fully account for and weeks to properly bury, weighted with the wounded who still needed to be evacuated, weighted with the simple and enormous fact of what had just occurred on this 300-acre strip of coral at the edge of nowhere. The men who walked that beach were not celebratory. They were quiet. They were looking at what it had cost to stand where they were standing, and the looking was not a comfortable thing. The declaration that Betio was secured on the 23rd of November did not mean that every inch of the island had been physically checked or that every surviving Japanese defender had been killed or accounted for. It meant that organized resistance, capable of threatening the American hold on the island as a military objective, had ceased. In the subsequent days, as the Marines consolidated their positions and began the grim work of accounting for the battle's dead, isolated Japanese defenders continued to be encountered in bunkers and hiding places across the island. Each of these encounters carried its own risk and produced its own additional casualties on a smaller scale but with the same finality that had characterized the three-day battle. The island was secured. The island was not safe. Those two things, secured and safe, were not the same thing at Betio, and the distinction had cost men their lives before and would cost more before the mopping up was complete. The other islands of Tarawa Atoll, the long chain of coral islets that curved around the lagoon beyond Betio, were secured in the days following the main battle. They were not heavily garrisoned, and their reduction did not approach the scale of the Betio fighting. The atoll was declared fully secured by the 28th of November, Thanksgiving Day in the United States, a coincidence of the calendar that would give the battle an additional layer of meaning when the news reached home. 8 days after the first Marines had waded ashore at Red Beach 1, the Gilbert Islands belonged to the United States. The price of that possession was in the record. The use to which it would be put, the airfield, the forward base, the next step in the drive across the Central Pacific, was yet to come. Chapter 10. What America Learned from the Photographs. The American public knew something had happened at Tarawa before they knew exactly what. The communiques that came out of the Pacific in the days following the battle were not evasive, exactly, but they were shaped by the communication practices of a government that was simultaneously fighting a war, managing public morale, and working out, in real time, the appropriate relationship between honest accounting and strategic necessity. The initial reports mentioned a Marine victory in the Gilbert Islands. They mentioned significant Japanese resistance. They mentioned American casualties. They did not convey, in the language of official communique, what 1,000 men dead in 76 hours on a 300-acre island actually looked like. That gap between the official language and the physical reality was about to be closed in a way that the government had not fully anticipated and could not fully control. Because the combat photographers who had gone into the beaches with the Marines had been doing their job, and their job required them to show the truth. The photographs from Tarawa were unlike anything the American public had been shown from any theatre of the war to that point. They showed Marines, American boys, dead in the water, dead on the beach, dead against the seawall. They showed the physical reality of what a machine gun does to a human body attempting to wade 500 yards across open water. They showed the faces of the dead with a clarity and proximity that the official communication of the war's costs had, up to that point, carefully avoided. The photographs had been taken by combat photographers who were themselves wading through the same water, carrying their cameras alongside their weapons, documenting the battle with the same commitment to accuracy that the best documentary photography demands. The prints were developed, sent back through military channels, reviewed, and initially held. The government's instinct was that images of this kind, images that showed, without qualification, the cost of the Pacific War in the specific and undeniable form of American dead, would damage morale. The instinct was not unreasonable, given the pressures of wartime public opinion management. What changed the calculation was a combination of press advocacy and a presidential decision that reflected an understanding of the American public more sophisticated than the initial instinct to protect. The argument made by journalists and military officials who favored release was direct. The American public was being asked to sacrifice their sons to this war, and they deserved to understand what that sacrifice actually looked like. Abstract casualty numbers, significant losses, did not convey the weight of what was being asked. The photographs did. An informed public, the argument went, was a more committed public, one that understood what it was fighting for and what it was paying, rather than one that was being managed and insulated from the full reality of the cost. President Roosevelt approved the release. The photographs ran in Life magazine and other publications in the weeks following Tarawa. They shocked the country. The response to the photographs was not the collapse in morale that the initial instinct to suppress them had predicted. It was something more complicated and, ultimately, more useful to the war effort. Americans were angry. They were grieving. They were, in many cases, reading the accounts and studying the photographs with the names of their own sons and brothers and husbands in their minds, calculating the probability that a face in that water was a face they knew. But they were not broken by what they saw. They were, in some demonstrable measure, more resolved, more clear about what the war was actually costing, and more committed to seeing it through to an end that was worth the price. The Tarawa photographs became, in the weeks following their publication, a kind of touchstone for the public understanding of the Pacific War, a reference point that made subsequent battles and subsequent casualty reports land with a different weight, because the country now knew, from visual evidence it could not set aside, what casualties meant in a physical and human sense. The controversy over the photographs did not end with their release. It opened a longer debate about the relationship between journalistic truth and wartime communication that would continue, in various forms, for the remainder of the war and well beyond it. Military officials argued, with some justification, that detailed visual documentation of American casualties could be useful to enemy intelligence, showing not just the costs inflicted on American forces, but the specific locations and conditions of those costs in ways that could inform future Japanese defensive planning. Journalists argued, with equal justification, that a democracy at war owed its citizens the most accurate possible account of what the war required. Neither argument was without merit. Both reflected real and competing obligations. The photographs remained in circulation. The debate about what a democracy should show its citizens about its wars has never been fully resolved, and Tarawa's images were among the first major exhibits in that ongoing argument. Robert Sherrod, the Time magazine correspondent who had waded ashore with the Marines on D-Day, published his account of the Tarawa battle in the weeks following the fighting. His writing gave the photographs a narrative context, placed the images within the arc of the assault, gave names and units to the shapes in the water, translated the visual shock of the photographs into the temporal sequence of decision and consequence and courage that had produced them. His reporting was direct and unsparing in its description of what he had witnessed, and it became one of the foundational texts of Pacific War journalism, a model for how combat correspondence could honor its subjects without sentimentalizing them, could convey the costs without exploiting them, could be honest about failure and terror without diminishing the courage that was present alongside those things. Sherrod's Tarawa dispatches were read by millions of Americans in a country that was trying to understand what was happening to its young men in the Pacific, and they provided a clarity that official communiques could not and did not attempt to provide. The debate within the American military about what Tarawa meant, about whether it had been a necessary operation or a costly mistake, about whether the planning had been adequate and the decision to proceed justified, began almost before the island was secured and would continue in formal and informal channels for months afterward. The military's institutional response to this debate was not defensive, though elements of defensiveness were present. It was, more usefully, analytical. Senior commanders understood that whatever else Tarawa represented, it represented a body of hard-won experience that could be translated into doctrine improvements that would make subsequent operations less costly. That translation from painful experience to revised practice was already beginning in the days after the battle, in the after-action reports that unit commanders were writing from positions still within earshot of the last isolated resistance on the eastern tip of the island. The machine of institutional learning was grinding forward even before the dead were buried. The reaction of the American public to the Tarawa photographs was shaped, in part, by the broader context of the war at that point in its progress. By November of 1943, the United States had been at war for nearly 2 years. The initial shock of Pearl Harbor had settled into the long, grinding commitment of a global industrial conflict that was consuming resources and lives at a rate that had no peacetime precedent. People at home understood, in a general way, that the war was costing. The photographs from Tarawa made that general understanding specific. They showed one battle, on one island, in 3 days, and the visual evidence was overwhelming. The question those photographs forced the country to confront was not whether the war was worth fighting, it was whether the way it was being fought was as effective as it could be, whether the costs were necessary costs or avoidable ones. That question, asked with the moral force of those images behind it, accelerated the military's own internal push for the doctrine reforms that would define amphibious warfare for the rest of the Pacific campaign. The photographers who took those images, men who were themselves under fire, who had made the same wade across the same reef, who had sheltered behind the same seawall, deserve to be understood as participants in the battle as much as documentarians of it. Their survival was a matter of fortune as much as any other man's on that beach. Their professional obligation to keep the camera steady, to compose the image, to capture the reality of what was happening around them required a particular kind of discipline, a maintenance of the observational function, while the survival function was also fully engaged. The images they produced were not the product of distance or detachment. They were made in the middle of the thing they were showing. That proximity is part of what gives them their lasting power, the sense, looking at a Tarawa photograph 60 or 70 years after it was taken, that the camera was not standing apart from the event but was fully inside it. The Tarawa photographs changed the language of the American war, not immediately, not in a single decisive moment. But over the weeks and months following their publication, they altered the frame through which the Pacific War was understood, moved it away from the abstracted language of strategy and maneuver and toward the specific, physical language of human cost. That shift did not make the war easier to prosecute. It made it, in some ways, harder because a public that understood the cost in human terms was a public that would continue to ask whether the cost was being managed as well as it could be. But it also made the war more honest. It created, in the American public consciousness, a more accurate model of what was being asked and what was being given. That accuracy, uncomfortable, uncompromising, built from photographs that nobody wanted to take, and a government that didn't want to release them, was one of the less heralded but genuinely significant contributions of Tarawa to the larger history of the conflict. Chapter 11. The Lessons Written in Blood. Every amphibious operation that the United States conducted after Tarawa was better than it would have been without Tarawa, and that improvement in planning, in equipment, in doctrine, in the simple understanding of what could go wrong and how to prevent it was the practical legacy of the 76 hours on Betio. This is not a comfortable kind of legacy. The idea that the deaths of more than 1,000 men were, in some functional sense, an investment that paid dividends in the survival of men in later battles is not a framing that honors the individuality of those deaths or that accounts adequately for the grief of the families who received the notification. But it is an accurate description of what happened, of how the American military processed the Tarawa experience and turned it into institutional knowledge that demonstrably improved the effectiveness and reduced the cost of every major amphibious operation that followed. The lessons were real, the application was real, the lives saved were real, even though they remain counterfactual, unmeasurable, and uncelebrated in any monument. The most immediately actionable lesson from Tarawa was the reef and tide problem. The catastrophic failure of the follow-on landing craft on D-Day, grounded on the reef by a tide that did not rise as expected, forcing thousands of men into a 500-yard wade under fire, was identified instantly and comprehensively as a planning and intelligence failure that could be prevented by better pre-assault reconnaissance. The solution was the underwater demolition teams, the UDTs, specially trained Navy swimmers who would conduct close-range reconnaissance of reef and beach conditions in the days before a planned landing, mapping water depths, identifying obstacles, locating mines, and providing the assault planners with the precise current information that had been missing at Tarawa. The UDTs were formally established in the weeks following Galvanic, drawing directly on the Tarawa experience as their operational justification. They were used in every major subsequent landing of the Pacific Campaign. They became, in the post-war era, the organizational ancestor of the United States Navy SEALs. The Amtrak, the landing vehicle tract that had been the salvation of the first 3 assault waves at Tarawa, emerged from the battle with a greatly elevated status in amphibious doctrine and a correspondingly expanded production commitment. Before Tarawa, the Amtrak had been viewed as a useful but auxiliary vehicle, a capability to have available rather than a central element of amphibious assault planning. After Tarawa, it became clear that for any landing against a reef-protected beach, the Amtrak was not an auxiliary. It was the only vehicle that could guarantee troops reached the shore regardless of tidal conditions. Production was ramped up significantly in the months following Galvanic. armored versions with protective plating to reduce the casualties that machine gun fire had inflicted on the thin-hulled LVTs at Tarawa were developed and fielded. By the time of the Marianas Campaign in the following year, the number of Amtraks available for Pacific assault operations was many times greater than what had been available at Tarawa, and the armored variants had substantially improved crew and passenger survivability. The Amtrak that saved the first waves at Tarawa became, through the lesson of its limitations, a much more capable weapon in the battles that followed. The pre-invasion bombardment problem, the discovery that the naval gunfire preceding the Tarawa landing had not neutralized the Japanese defenses to anything approaching the degree the planners had expected, drove a fundamental revision of how long and how precisely pre-landing fires needed to be applied. At Tarawa, the bombardment had run for approximately 2 hours before the first waves were sent in. Planners had believed 2 hours was sufficient, given the weight of fire being delivered to such a small area. The battle's evidence demonstrated that it was not that the quality of Japanese construction could withstand naval bombardment far better than pre-war estimates had assumed, and that effective neutralization required either a dramatically longer bombardment or a fundamentally more precise one, or both. In subsequent operations in the Central Pacific, at Roy Namur, at Kwajalein, at Saipan, the pre-landing bombardment was measured in days rather than hours. At Iwo Jima, the Marines would request a 10-day preliminary bombardment. They received 3 days, which they considered insufficient, and the battle validated their concern. At Okinawa, the improvements were more comprehensive. Each step in that progression was, in part, a response to what Tarawa had taught about the relationship between time, fire, and the quality of Japanese defensive construction. Communication that persistent, crippling failure throughout the Tarawa battle, from the first waves landing to the last reserves coming ashore, was identified in every major after-action review as a systemic problem requiring systemic solutions. The radios of 1943 were not adequate to the demands of a large-scale amphibious assault. They were too fragile, too susceptible to water damage, too limited in range, too reliant on trained operators who were also combat soldiers being asked to perform 2 demanding jobs simultaneously. The fixes were partly technological, better waterproofing, more robust equipment, backup systems, and partly doctrinal, involving changes in how communications were organized and staffed for amphibious operations. The shore fire control parties that in later operations would provide the critical link between the Marines on the beach and the naval guns offshore were refined and expanded as a direct result of the communication breakdowns at Tarawa. The reserves that sat offshore for hours at Tarawa while the beach situation was unclear never sat that long in the same circumstances again. The medical lessons from Tarawa drove changes in casualty evacuation procedures that are less glamorous than the tactical lessons, but equally important in their impact on the lives of wounded men. The inability to efficiently evacuate wounded from the beach through the reef and back to the ships had allowed men to die from treatable wounds on a beach within sight of surgical capability. The improvements that followed involved both physical resources, more Amtraks dedicated to casualty evacuation, better medical equipment positioned in the assault waves, and procedural changes that gave medical evacuation explicit priority in the planning and execution of subsequent landings. The Navy's hospital ships, their positioning, their communication with beach medical parties, all of this was reviewed and improved in the months following Galvanic. The specific mortality rate from wounds at Tarawa, compared to later Pacific operations, is one of the grimmer measures of how much this learning mattered. The role of air support in the Tarawa battle, specifically the critical gap between the end of the pre-landing bombardment and the arrival of the airstrikes, and the compressed, poorly coordinated nature of the air operations throughout the battle, drove revisions in how close air support was planned and controlled. At Tarawa, the lack of a systematic, responsive close air support system meant that the Marines on the beach could not quickly direct aircraft against specific positions that were inflicting casualties. The coordination between the ground force and the aircraft was too slow and too imprecise for the conditions of close-range fighting, where the target and the friendly force were often separated by tens of yards rather than hundreds. The development of forward air controllers trained Marine officers who could direct aircraft against specific targets in real time from ground positions, was accelerated by the Tarawa experience. By the time of Iwo Jima, the close air support system available to the Marines was incomparably better than what had existed at Tarawa, and that improvement had a direct and measurable effect on the battle's outcomes. The intelligence failure at Tarawa, the underestimation of the garrison's strength by roughly half, the inadequate mapping of the defensive positions, the faulty tide data produced the most extensive pre-invasion intelligence gathering effort in the Pacific War's history for the operations that followed. The UDTs addressed the hydrographic intelligence problem, improved aerial photographic analysis, using techniques refined in the months after Tarawa, produced better maps of Japanese defensive positions on subsequent target islands. Interrogation of the handful of Japanese prisoners taken at Tarawa and on other islands provided limited but useful insight into garrison compositions and defensive priorities. No subsequent amphibious assault in the Central Pacific went in with an intelligence picture as incomplete as the one the Tarawa planners had worked from. This was not because intelligence collection became suddenly easy or perfectly reliable. It never did, but because the cost of the Tarawa intelligence gaps had been vividly established, and that cost created an institutional motivation to do better that was as powerful as any formal directive. The doctrinal revolution that Tarawa accelerated extended beyond the specific tactical and logistical problems the battle had exposed, into the broader question of how amphibious assault capability was organized, trained, and resourced within the American military. The battle demonstrated, with a clarity that no planning exercise could have produced, that amphibious assault against a fortified and determined enemy was among the most demanding military operations conceivable, requiring specialized training, specialized equipment, and specialized command and control arrangements that could not be improvised from general military capability. The investment in amphibious capability that followed Tarawa in training, in equipment development, in doctrinal refinement was enormous by any measure, and it produced, by the war's final year, a combined arms amphibious assault capability that was without precedent in military history. That capability did not exist before Tarawa in anything like the form it took after. Betio was the school. The tuition was paid in lives. The most lasting lesson of Tarawa, and the one that is perhaps most difficult to articulate in the language of doctrine revision, is the lesson about assumption. The assumptions that had been built into the Tarawa plan about the tide, about the effectiveness of the bombardment, about the garrison's strength, about the reliability of communications were not reckless assumptions. They were the reasonable assumptions of experienced professional officers working from the best information available to them. And every one of them was wrong in ways that cost men their lives. The lesson is not that assumptions should not be made. Military planning is impossible without assumptions. The lesson is that assumptions must be examined, tested, and, where possible, replaced by verified information, and that the cost of unexamined assumptions is paid not by the planners who made them, but by the men in the water. That lesson is one of the oldest in military history. Tarawa paid for it again, at a price that left no room for forgetting. Chapter 12. The survivors and the silence they carried. They came home. Not all of them, not by far, but those who did. The men who had waded the reef and held the seawall and cleared the bunkers and survived the nights, came back to a country that had seen the photographs and read the dispatches and thought it understood what Tarawa had been. It did not understand. Understanding requires the full weight of the experience, the sound, the smell, the specific quality of time passing on that beach, the faces of the men who died beside you, the particular texture of the coral under your boots at the moment you stopped believing you would survive and continued moving anyway. These are not things that can be transmitted through journalism or photography or official communique. They are private, interior things, carried inside the men who had them, not easily given and not easily received even when the attempt was made to give them. The survivors of Tarawa came home and were, in the most ordinary and human sense, changed not in ways they could always name, but in ways that shaped how they slept and how they talked and what they could not talk about for the rest of their lives. Post-traumatic stress, as a clinical category, did not exist in the vocabulary of 1943 or of the years immediately following the war. What was understood vaguely, imprecisely, and without the framework of modern psychological medicine was that men who had seen combat were sometimes shell-shocked, sometimes battle-fatigued, sometimes simply not right, in ways that their families noticed and that the men themselves struggled to account for. The Tarawa veterans carried what they carried with the same stoic silence that their generation applied to most things that were too heavy to speak about directly. They went back to work, they raised families, they built the post-war American life that their survival had made possible. And inside all of that normalcy, the reef and the seawall and the night counterattacks lived on in the nightmares, in the startle response to loud noises, in the inability to talk about specific things, in the look that came into a man's eyes if you asked the wrong question at the wrong time. The reunions of the 2nd Marine Division gatherings that began in the years following the war and continued for decades became, for many Tarawa veterans, the primary context in which the experience could be spoken about, because the only people who fully understood it were the people who had been there. In those reunion spaces, hotel ballrooms and convention centers, and, in later years, the grounds of the memorials that had been built to mark the battle men who had spent most of their civilian lives not talking about Betio could, among each other, use the language of the experience directly. The names of the beaches, the names of the positions, the names of the men who hadn't come back. The shorthand that survivors develop for shared experience that cannot be efficiently conveyed in ordinary language, a word or a reference that detonates a full memory. The shorthand that survivors develop for shared experience that cannot be efficiently conveyed in ordinary language, a word or a reference that detonates a full memory in the listener who was there while meaning almost nothing to someone who was alive in those rooms. The men who attended those reunions described them as the only places where they did not have to translate what they knew into something that someone else could follow. Among themselves, they could speak plainly. The reef was the reef, the seawall was the seawall, the wade was the wade. And the men who did not come home were present at every reunion in the specific, weighted way that the dead are present among those who loved them and watched them die not as abstractions, but as specific people, remembered with the particular sharpness that trauma preserves and time does not diminish. The widows and the families of the men who died at Tarawa received in most cases a telegram. The telegram used the formal language of official military notification, the language designed to deliver the information clearly and completely while maintaining the professional distance that the scale of wartime casualties required. It said that their son, their husband, their brother had been killed in action in the Pacific. It gave a date. It expressed the condolences of the Secretary of the Navy. It did not say anything about the reef. It did not say anything about the wade or the seawall or the way the tide had not come on the morning of the 20th of November, 1943. Those details would come later, if they came at all from survivors who had been beside the man when he died, in letters that were often incomplete because the writer was trying to say something that words were not adequate to, and because military censorship limited what could be said explicitly about operational details. The families of the Tarawa dead learned to live with a knowledge that was always partial, a loss that was complete, and a story that never quite was. The physical wounds that the survivors carried home were, for many men, the more manageable part of the Tarawa legacy. A shrapnel scar, a missing finger, a leg that ached in cold weather, these were visible, tangible, socially legible forms of the war's cost. The medical system of the post-war era understood physical wounds. It had categories for them, treatments for them, compensation structures for them. The invisible wounds, the ones that lived in the nervous system, in the sleep architecture, in the threat detection circuitry of men, whose brains had been shaped by 3 days of total immersion in the most extreme form of human experience, were less legible to the systems designed to address them. The Veterans Administration of the immediate post-war years was not equipped, conceptually or practically, to address the psychological complexity of what the Tarawa survivors carried. Men were expected to return to civilian life and resume civilian functioning, and many of them did so outwardly, functionally while carrying a weight that the civilian world had no language for and that they had no way to set down. The question of whether Tarawa was worth its cost was one that the survivors themselves engaged with privately, and in some cases publicly, for the rest of their lives. It was not a simple question, and the men who had been there were not unanimous in their answers. Some felt with conviction that the lessons of Tarawa, the doctrine revisions, the equipment improvements, the intelligence reforms, had saved thousands of American lives in subsequent operations, and that this made the cost, however terrible, a cost that the larger picture of the war justified. Others felt that the planning failures, the inadequate tide intelligence, the underestimation of the garrison, the compressed bombardment had produced casualties that better preparation could have prevented, and that the loss of those men was therefore not a necessary cost of war, but a cost of insufficient planning that fell on the men in the water, rather than on the officers at the planning tables. Both perspectives had merit. Neither fully resolved the question for the men who carried it. Colonel David Shoup, who would go on to become Commandant of the Marine Corps, the highest office his service could bestow, before retiring and becoming, in the 1960s, one of the most outspoken military critics of American military adventurism, carried Tarawa in a specific and public way that most of his fellow veterans did not. Shoup used the authority that his Medal of Honor and his career had given him to speak about what he had seen and what he believed the military experience, at its most extreme and costly, should teach a democratic society about the use of force. His opposition to the Vietnam War drew explicitly on the Tarawa experience, on what he had learned, in the most uncompromising possible circumstances, about the relationship between planning, leadership, and the lives of the men who bear the cost of both. He remained, to the end of his life, a figure whose public voice was inseparable from what he had survived on that beach in 1943. The Medal of Honor he wore was not, for him, a symbol of triumph. It was a weight, a responsibility, an obligation to speak accurately about the cost of war borne by the man who had seen that cost from the closest possible range. The Japanese survivors, the 17 soldiers who had been taken prisoner, the Korean laborers who had survived in the margins of the battle carried their own versions of the Tarawa experience, versions that were shaped by completely different cultural frameworks and completely different relationships to the outcome. The Japanese prisoners faced, on their return home after the war, a social reality that their culture's framework around surrender made nearly unbearable. Men who had survived captivity after a battle in which almost all of their comrades had died were regarded, in the rigid moral calculus of Imperial Japanese military culture, as having failed in the most fundamental sense. Several Tarawa prisoners described, in accounts given years after the war, the difficulty of existing in the space between a culture that had defined survival through surrender as dishonor and a personal reality of having survived and needing to make sense of that survival. Their accounts add a dimension to the Tarawa story that the American military narrative, understandably focused on the American experience, cannot provide from within itself. The Korean laborers who had built Batio's defenses and survived the battle occupy perhaps the most invisible position in the entire Tarawa narrative. Their presence on the island was involuntary, their labor was compelled, their survival was accidental, and their story was told by neither the American military, which had no institutional category for them, nor the Japanese military, which regarded them as tools rather than participants. Of the more than 129 who survived, most were eventually repatriated, returning to a career that was itself in the process of profound political transformation, liberated from Japanese colonial control by Japan's eventual defeat, then divided by the political arrangements of the post-war settlement into two states that would themselves soon be at war. The men who had survived Tarawa, by building the fortress that killed more than 1,000 Marines, were absorbed back into a history that had no specific place for them, and that offered no formal acknowledgement of what they had experienced. Their silence is part of the Tarawa record, even if the record does not always make room for it. The question of memorialization, how to mark what happened on Batio, how to give the dead an acknowledgement that honors the specificity of their sacrifice, was addressed in the years following the war with the construction of monuments and the designation of the airfield as Hawkins Field in honor of the first lieutenant who had cleared the pier on D-Day and died the following afternoon, refusing to leave his men. The formal memorials on Betio mark the ground where the battle was fought and provide a physical location for the grief and the respect that the battle continues to generate. But memorialization on a remote Pacific island, accessible only with significant effort and expense, has a different reach than the battle deserves. For most Americans, Tarawa exists, when it exists at all, in the documentary record, in the photographs, in the accounts of men like Sherrod, in the histories written by military scholars who understood that what happened on that reef was too important to allow to disappear into the general obscurity of events that are too painful to examine directly. The 2nd Marine Division's identity, the institutional self-understanding that shapes the culture of a military unit across generations of membership, was permanently marked by Tarawa. The battle became the unit's central reference point, the event against which all subsequent tests were measured and from which the unit's understanding of its own capabilities and obligations was drawn. The Fighting Second was not just a designation. It was a claim grounded in the specific evidence of what the 2nd Marine Division had done on Betio in November of 1943, in the specific circumstances of a battle that had tested the unit beyond any reasonable expectation and found it capable of enduring. That institutional memory, carried forward through decades and through generations of Marines who were born after the battle ended, is part of how Tarawa continues to matter, not as historical curiosity, but as living reference, as the answer to the question every military unit eventually has to answer about what it is and what it is capable of when the conditions are at their worst. The graves registration work in the days following the battle's end on Betio was among the most difficult duties assigned to any unit in the Pacific War. The dead, more than 1,000 American, more than 4,000 Japanese, lay across an island whose entire surface had been fought over, in positions and conditions that required careful, painstaking work to identify and account for. The American dead were ultimately buried in military cemeteries that were later consolidated, their remains moved in the post-war years as part of the larger effort to account for and repatriate the American war dead from across the Pacific. A number of Tarawa casualties were not fully recovered and identified for decades after the war in some cases. Not until the 21st century, when private organizations undertook excavation efforts on Betio to locate and identify the remains of Marines whose families had waited for more than 70 years to bring them home. That ongoing effort, the search for the missing, the work of identification and return, is its own chapter in the Tarawa story, one that the passage of time has not closed, and that carries its own particular weight for the families and the descendants of the men who have not yet fully come home. The survivors of Tarawa grew old in a country that changed in ways they had not anticipated, and that did not always seem to remember what had been paid for the freedom it took for granted. They watched the Pacific War recede in public consciousness, pushed back by subsequent events and subsequent crises and the ordinary amnesia of a culture that moves quickly from one emergency to the next. Some of them spoke at schools and veteran gatherings, telling what they could tell to audiences whose relationship to the events was entirely historical. Some of them stayed silent, keeping the reef and the seawall and the names of their dead in the private interior where those things had always lived. All of them carried Tarawa until they no longer carried anything. The last survivors of the 2nd Marine Division's assault on Betio have now passed. The men who waded that water are gone, their direct testimony beyond recovery. What remains is the record they left in documents and photographs and oral histories and the institutional memory of the Corps and the obligation of those who come after to hold that record accurately, to resist the simplifications that distance encourages, and to understand what those men did and what it cost with something approaching the honesty the experience deserves. Chapter 13. The Japanese Perspective. Fortress Without Retreat. There is a version of the Tarawa story that has almost never been told in the American documentary tradition, and it is the version seen from the other side of the seawall. Not to honor the cause that placed those men on that island was neither just nor defensible by any standard that history has since applied to it, but because understanding a battle completely requires understanding both sides of it, and the men who built Betio's defenses and held them with such absolute commitment were, in the most human sense, as fully realized as the men who came across the reef to take them. They had names, they had families, they had come from towns and cities and farming communities across Japan, had been formed by a culture with its own long history and its own deep understanding of what honor and duty required. They had been placed on a coral island in the middle of the Pacific and told to hold it until death, and they had understood this as an obligation rather than a sentence. Engaging with who those men were, not what they served, but who they were is part of the honest accounting that Tarawa demands. The garrison that Rear Admiral Shibasaki commanded on Betio was not assembled haphazardly. The 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, the Rikusentai, who formed the combat corps of the defense, was selected and trained over a period of years for exactly the kind of static defensive fighting that the island's terrain and tactical situation required. They understood the principles of interlocking fire, of mutually supporting positions, of holding ground by making the cost of taking it prohibitive rather than by maneuvering against the attacker. Their training was thorough, their discipline was exceptional, and their ideological preparation, the Bushido framework that shaped their understanding of their own role in the battle, had been reinforced throughout their military service in ways that left no conceptual space for surrender. The distinction between professional capability and the cause that employed it is uncomfortable but necessary. These were serious, skilled, dedicated soldiers serving a militarist empire that had committed horrific acts across Asia and the Pacific. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. Shibasaki himself had assessed the strategic situation with a clarity that his famous boast that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years somewhat obscures. The boast was real in the sense that it reflected his genuine confidence in the quality of his fortifications. But Shibasaki was also a professional officer who understood that his garrison, however well fortified, was ultimately isolated, that no resupply, no reinforcement, and no relief would come once the American assault began. He had read the strategic situation in the Pacific by the autumn of 1943, accurately enough to know that Japan's naval and air power in the Central Pacific had been significantly degraded since the battles of 1942, and that the American fleet, assembling to his north, was a force his garrison could not ultimately resist. What Shibasaki was building, what he was preparing his men to do, was not a defense designed to survive. It was a defense designed to cost. His objective was not to hold the island forever. It was to make the Americans pay so heavily for taking it that the entire Central Pacific drive would be slowed or reconsidered. By that measure, and in a purely tactical sense, his defense came very close to achieving its purpose. The individual Japanese soldier in his bunker on Betio, on the morning of the 20th of November, occupied a psychological state that Western military psychology has always found difficult to fully comprehend. The framework of Bushido, the code that governed the moral and behavioral obligations of the Japanese military man, was not a cultural overlay applied to an otherwise Western understanding of warfare. It was a different epistemology of violence, a different relationship between individual survival and collective obligation. The man who chose to die in his position rather than surrender was not, within that framework, choosing death. He was choosing honor, a concept so fundamental to his identity that life without it was not a meaningful alternative. This is not offered as justification. It is offered as description, because the behavior of the Betio garrison, the near-total absence of surrender, the continuation of resistance in positions that were clearly destroyed, and from which no tactical purpose could be served by further fighting, cannot be accurately understood without the cultural context that produced it. The death of Shibasaki on the first day of the battle, most likely during the naval bombardment or in its immediate aftermath, though the exact circumstances remain unclear, was a significant factor in the battle's tactical unfolding, though probably not a decisive one. The defense that Shibasaki had built was designed to function without centralized direction, precisely because he understood that an amphibious assault of this scale would inevitably disrupt communications and kill commanders at the moment when centralized direction was most needed. Each position was a self-contained fighting unit, capable of sustaining its own defense without orders from above. What Shibasaki's death removed was not the capacity of the individual positions to fight, they demonstrated that capacity fully to the last hour of the last day, but the possibility of coordinated offensive action, of the kind of organized counterattack that might have exploited a gap in the marine perimeter on the first night and turned a beachhead crisis into a beachhead collapse. The garrison fought without him with all the ferocity his training had produced. It just could not coordinate that ferocity into a single, directed blow. The Japanese perspective on the Betio defense was shaped, in the accounts that survived the war, by a combination of professional pride in what had been built and a kind of pragmatic fatalism about how it would end. Letters and diaries recovered from the island after the battle, along with post-war accounts from the handful of Japanese who survived, describe men who understood their situation with remarkable clarity and had made peace with it. They had been told by their culture that this was the highest form of service, to hold a position, to inflict maximum cost on the enemy, to die in the performance of duty. They believed this, or they had trained themselves to behave as if they believed it, which in a combat environment is functionally the same thing. What the diary entries and the letters reveal, and what the post-war accounts of the few survivors confirm, is that this acceptance was not passive. It was active, chosen, maintained daily, against the ordinary human fear of death that no training entirely extinguishes. The men on Betio were afraid. They chose to fight anyway, within a framework that gave their fear a destination, the performance of duty rather than an escape. The tactical genius of Shibasaki's defensive layout was recognized explicitly by the American officers who examined the island after the battle, and their recognition was not grudging. The interlocking fields of fire, the construction quality of the bunkers, the positioning of the heavier weapons to engage threats at the reef line, all of these represented a standard of defensive engineering that American officers, with the dispassionate professionalism of their trade, acknowledged as exceptional. The Marine after-action reports on Betio's defences read, in places, like engineering assessments, precise, technical, respectful of the craft behind the construction even while describing the process of destroying it. This professional recognition is part of the complete picture of Tarawa. The battle was hard because the defense was good. The defense was good because the men who built it were skilled. Acknowledging the skill does not honor the cause, it honors the accuracy of the record. The propaganda use that Imperial Japan made of the Betio defense in the weeks following the battle, as the reality of the garrison's destruction became known, was instructive about how the Japanese military and political establishment understood the loss. The garrison was presented not as defeated, but as triumphant in the most meaningful sense. They had fulfilled their duty, inflicted enormous casualties on the enemy, and died with honor intact. The near-total death of the garrison was framed as proof of the code's validity, rather than evidence of the strategic futility of the defense. Casualty figures for the American side were presented to the Japanese public in numbers that were, in some cases, inflated. The actual American losses were severe enough that inflation was almost unnecessary, but the propaganda requirement of demonstrating that the Americans had paid dearly for every inch of Pacific soil drove the presentation of the Betio battle as a kind of moral victory dressed in the language of defeat. The Japanese home front was not told that 4,700 defenders had been killed. They were told that 4,700 had died with honor. The strategic failure of the Betio defense, the failure that Shibasaki's tactical success could not prevent, was the failure of the larger Japanese strategic framework that had placed that garrison there in the first place. The outer defensive perimeter strategy, of which Betio was a component, assumed a level of Japanese naval and air power that, by the autumn of 1943, no longer existed in the form required to make the strategy viable. The garrison on Betio had been promised, in the broad sense of Japanese strategic doctrine, that the combined fleet would be available to contest an American move against the Central Pacific. By the time the American ships appeared on the horizon, the combined fleet was not coming. The garrison knew this, or had reasons to suspect it. They held anyway not because holding was strategically rational, but because holding was what duty required. The gap between tactical performance and strategic outcome at Tarawa, between a defense that came very close to achieving its tactical purpose and a strategic situation in which that achievement could not alter the larger course of the war, is one of the clearest illustrations in the Pacific War of what happens when tactical excellence is deployed in service of a strategy that has already been overtaken by events. The voices of the Japanese defenders at Betio, preserved in the documents recovered after the battle, in the post-war testimony of the handful of survivors, in the accounts gathered by Japanese historians in the decades following the war, deserve to be part of how Tarawa is remembered, not as a counterweight to the American experience, but as its completion. The battle was fought by human beings on both sides, shaped by different cultures and different obligations and different understandings of what they were doing and why. The American narrative of Tarawa is, and should be, centered on the Marines who waded the reef and held the seawall and paid the cost of the tide that did not come. But the fullness of that narrative requires the acknowledgement that on the other side of the seawall were men who also had names, also had families, also understood the situation they were in with terrible clarity, and also met it according to everything they had been formed by. The battle belonged to both of them. The record belongs to both of them. The honest telling of the story holds them both. Chapter 14. Island Hopping. Tarawa's place in the larger war. Tarawa did not exist in isolation. It was a single engagement in a strategic campaign of enormous scope and complexity, and its significance, both the significance of the victory and the significance of the lessons, can only be fully understood when it is placed within the larger arc of the Pacific War's progress from the dark days of 1942 through the grinding middle period of 1943 to the accelerating offensive operations of 1944 and 1945. The island hopping strategy that Admiral Nimitz was executing the systematic advance across the Central Pacific, capturing or neutralizing Japanese-held islands in a sequence designed to bring American air power progressively closer to the Japanese home islands, was, at the time of Tarawa, a strategy that had been declared but not yet proven. Operation Galvanic was its first major test. The results of that test, the tactical success purchased at catastrophic cost, shaped every subsequent decision about how the strategy would be implemented. The Gilbert Islands campaign of November 1943, of which Tarawa was the main event and make-in, attacked simultaneously by the Army. The secondary established the pattern that would define the Central Pacific drive for the next 2 years. Seize an atoll, build or repair the airfield. Use that airfield to neutralize the next atoll. Move on. The logic was clean. The execution was expensive. Each island in the chain presented its own defensive challenges, its own garrison, its own reef and tide and weather conditions. But each island after Tarawa was approached with the accumulated knowledge of the previous engagement, applied through the doctrine revisions and equipment improvements that the after-action review process was generating in real time. Kwajalein, in February of 1944, was taken in 4 days at a fraction of the casualty rate per man committed that Tarawa had produced. The lessons were working. The blood of Tarawa was, in the most literal operational sense, being converted into the survival of men at Kwajalein and Eniwetok and Saipan. The debate over the island hopping strategy, over whether every island in the chain needed to be taken or whether some could be bypassed and simply neutralized, was ongoing at the highest levels of American command. Throughout this period, the bypass argument held that some Japanese garrison islands could be left to wither, cut off from resupply, unable to threaten American lines of communication, shrinking through attrition without requiring a costly amphibious assault. This argument had strategic merit and was, in several cases, applied successfully. Rabaul, the major Japanese base in the southwest Pacific, was eventually bypassed rather than assaulted, and its garrison was left to deteriorate until the war's end. The question for the Gilberts, and specifically for Betio, was whether the bypass option was viable. The answer was no, primarily because of the airfield. A functioning Japanese airfield on Betio, within range of the central Pacific sea lanes that American forces needed for their supply lines, could not be ignored. It had to be taken or neutralized, and neutralization without seizure required an ongoing air and sea commitment that the strategy could not sustain. Betio had to be assaulted. Tarawa was the price of the airfield. The strategic relationship between Tarawa and the subsequent Marianas Campaign, the seizure of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the summer of 1944, illustrates with particular clarity how the investment of Galvanic paid its strategic dividend. The Marianas were the objective that the Central Pacific Drive had been building toward since its inception islands, close enough to the Japanese home islands that B-29 bombers operating from their airfields could reach Tokyo and the major Japanese industrial cities. The Marianas Campaign was made possible by the seizure of the Gilberts, which provided the forward bases that allowed the advance to continue. And the Marianas Campaign itself, the bloodiest of the Central Pacific operations in terms of absolute casualties, was conducted with the amphibious assault doctrine that Tarawa had forced the American military to develop. More Amtraks, better armed and better armored, longer preliminary bombardment, UDT reconnaissance of the reef and beach conditions, forward air controllers able to direct close air support in real time, all of it traceable, in direct doctrinal lineage, to the lessons of Betio. The parallel war in the Southwest Pacific, MacArthur's drive up through New Guinea toward the Philippines, was proceeding simultaneously with the Central Pacific Campaign, creating the two-pronged advance that would eventually converge on the Philippine Sea and beyond. The interaction between the two strategies, the competition for resources, the arguments about priorities, the occasional friction between MacArthur's army-centric approach and Nimitz's Navy-Marine vision shaped the overall pace and direction of the Pacific War in ways that neither strategy alone would have produced. Tarawa sits firmly within the Nimitz vision. It is the Central Pacific Drive in its most essential form, the willingness to pay a steep, immediate price for a strategic asset that enables the next step in the advance. MacArthur's operations, by contrast, were more often characterized by maneuver and bypass using the Pacific's geography to avoid the most heavily defended positions rather than to assault them directly. Both approaches had merit. Both had costs. The Pacific War's final chapter required elements of both. The Japanese strategic response to the loss of the Gilbert Islands, and specifically to the demonstration at Tarawa of American amphibious capability, was to accelerate the fortification of the Marshall Islands, the next objective in the American Central Pacific advance. Japanese commanders drew the conclusion from Betio that the existing fortification standards were inadequate, that if a garrison as well prepared as Shibasaki's had been reduced in 76 hours, subsequent defensive positions would need to be even more formidable. They invested significantly in the Marshall Islands fortifications in the months following Tarawa, attempting to build defenses that would be even more resistant to the naval bombardment and close-range assault that had taken Betio. In a tactical sense, they were partially right. The Marshall Islands garrisons produced fierce resistance when the American assault came in February of 1944. In a strategic sense, they were solving the wrong problem. The Americans were not going to assault every island. They were going to bypass most of them. The investment in Marshall Islands fortification was, in significant part, irrelevant to the outcome of the campaign, because American planners, informed by the Tarawa experience, were selecting their assault targets more carefully. The air dimension of the Tarawa legacy extended beyond close air support doctrine into the fundamental question of how carrier aviation supported amphibious operations. The fast carrier task forces that provided the air umbrella for Galvanic, the fleet carriers and light carriers that neutralized Japanese land-based air power in the Gilberts and Marshalls before and during the landings, were still a relatively new operational concept in November of 1943, and their performance during Galvanic established a pattern of carrier amphibious integration that would define Pacific operations for the remainder of the war. The loss of the escort carrier Liscome Bay, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine while supporting Galvanic, with the loss of 646 officers and enlisted men, added a further dimension to the lessons of the operation, specifically about the vulnerability of slower, less protected carriers to submarine attack in contested waters. Submarine screening around escort carriers was tightened in subsequent operations as a direct result of the Liscombe Bay's loss. The lesson cost 646 lives. The domestic American political context within which the Tarawa battle was received and processed is an underappreciated dimension of its larger significance. The 1944 presidential election, in which Franklin Roosevelt would seek an unprecedented fourth term, was less than a year away when Tarawa was fought. The management of public expectations about the Pacific War's cost, and about whether the strategy being pursued was the best available strategy, was a political as well as a military concern. The Tarawa photographs and the debate they provoked about American casualty figures and the government's handling of wartime information were, in a modest but real sense, political events as well as journalistic ones. The administration's decision to release the photographs was partly a response to the political reality that continued suppression of obvious truths would ultimately be more damaging to public confidence than the truth itself. Tarawa contributed to a more honest public conversation about what the Pacific War was costing, and that more honest conversation, while it created short-term discomfort, produced a more realistic public understanding of the war's demands that served the war effort better in the long run than managed optimism would have. The naval dimension of Galvanic's legacy, specifically the lessons about command and control of large amphibious forces, about the relationship between the naval commander offshore and the ground force commander on the beach, about the communication architecture necessary to make joint operations function under the conditions of an opposed amphibious landing, I was worked through in the months following the battle with the thoroughness that the American military was capable of when it chose to apply its institutional learning mechanisms seriously. The command relationships at Tarawa had been imperfect. There were points during the first day when the most senior commanders offshore genuinely did not know whether the landing was succeeding or failing, and those imperfections were studied and addressed in the doctrine revisions that preceded subsequent operations. The joint amphibious command structure that the United States military had developed by the time of the Okinawa operation in 1945 was incomparably more capable than the structure that had existed at Tarawa, and that development was driven in significant part by the specific failures identified at Betio. By the time the Pacific War reached its final chapter, the preparation for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, that was being planned in the summer of 1945, the American amphibious assault capability had been transformed so completely from what it had been at Tarawa that the two were almost different species of military operation. The numbers of Amtraks, the duration of preliminary bombardments, the sophistication of pre-assault reconnaissance, the integration of close air support, the medical evacuation systems, the command and control architecture, all of it had been developed through the accumulated experience of the Central Pacific Campaign, with Tarawa as the first and in many ways the most instructive data point. Operation Downfall was never executed. The atomic bombs and the Soviet declaration of war against Japan produced a Japanese surrender before the invasion was launched, but the plan that existed for it was, in its amphibious components, a direct descendant of the lessons paid for at Betio. The men who would have waded those beaches, and who were saved that experience by the war's sudden end, owed a debt to Tarawa's dead that most of them never knew they carried. Chapter 15. The Commanders. Portraits of Leadership Under Fire. Leadership is one of those concepts that is easy to discuss in the abstract and very difficult to define in the specific until you place it in a context where its presence or absence has immediate, irreversible, and lethal consequences, and then it becomes the clearest and most important thing in the environment. Tarawa was exactly that kind of context. The men who commanded at Betio at every level, from the generals on the command ships offshore to the sergeants behind the seawall, making decisions with no officers alive to make them, were being tested by conditions that no peacetime training could fully replicate and no previous experience could entirely prepare for. Some of them rose to the test in ways that have entered the permanent record of what military leadership can be. Some of them found the limits of what their training and temperament could sustain. All of them were human beings doing the hardest thing that human beings are ever asked to do, and looking at them closely not as symbols or monuments, but as individuals is part of the honest reckoning that Tarawa demands. Major General Julian C. Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division from the transport ship Monrovia, occupied one of the most psychologically demanding positions that a commander can occupy, the position of responsibility without visibility. Smith knew that his Marines were on that beach, knew they were taking severe casualties, knew that the decisions he made about committing his reserves would determine whether the beachhead survived, and he was making those decisions with communications that were fragmentary, intermittent, and in some cases contradictory. The temptation in that situation is toward one of two errors: either premature commitment of reserves based on incomplete information, gambling them into a situation that may be more manageable than the reports suggest, or excessive caution that withholds them too long while men on the beach bleed out, waiting for reinforcement. Smith navigated between those errors with the steadiness of a commander who had spent a career developing the judgment to know the difference between a situation that needs time and a situation that needs action. His decision to commit the 6th Marines on the morning of the 2nd day, timed as it was, framed as it was not a brilliant decision in the way that hindsight presents some military decisions. It was a sound decision, made in conditions of extreme uncertainty, by a man who had been formed by a career that prepared him for exactly this kind of uncertainty. Colonel David Shoup's leadership at the seawall is, in many ways, the human center of the Tarawa story, the individual act of will that most clearly expresses what held the beachhead together in the first hours when nothing else was holding. Shoup waded ashore under fire, was wounded almost immediately, established a command post in conditions that made conventional command post functions essentially impossible, and proceeded to direct the battle from that position for the entirety of the critical first day and into the second. What he did was not spectacular in the cinematic sense. He did not lead charges or perform feats of individual combat. What he did was stay in a position that was being fired on, stay in communication with the units he could reach, stay in the role of the person who was making the decisions that needed to be made and providing the anchor of visible, functioning command that the men around him needed to continue functioning themselves. His Medal of Honor citation recognized the totality of this, not a single act of valor but sustained leadership under conditions that would have justified, by any objective standard, evacuation and relief. He refused evacuation. He stayed. The beachhead held. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Amy, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, was killed in the water on D-Day morning. His Higgins boat stopped at the reef, wading toward the beach, hit before he reached it. His death early, sudden, before he had the opportunity to exercise the command for which he had prepared, represents the category of leadership loss that military operations of this kind produce at their most brutal. Not the failure of the leader, but the elimination of the leader at the moment when leadership was most needed, leaving the units he commanded to be reorganized by whoever survived. The battalions that lost their commanders on the reef and in the water at Betio did not collapse. They were led forward by whoever could lead senior NCOs, junior officers, men who had never expected to command at battalion level and who did so anyway, imperfectly and heroically, and at a cost that included their own lives in many cases. The informal leadership that emerged in those first hours, the leadership of the man who stood up when standing up was the only available option, is part of what the Tarawa record shows about where military capability actually lives in a unit when the formal command structure has been hit. First Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins occupies a unique position in the Tarawa leadership narrative because his story so directly refutes the institutional dismissal that had been applied to his specialty in the months before the program. Battle. Hawkins commanded a scout sniper platoon that Marine Corps headquarters had been considering disbanding as operationally irrelevant to Pacific Island warfare. His actions on the pier on D-Day, clearing a fortified structure that threatened to deliver flanking fire across the entire northern landing beach, continuing to fight after being wounded, refusing evacuation, leading his 34 men with a tactical audacity that turned a specialized reconnaissance unit into a close assault team, demonstrated something that no amount of institutional debate could have established: that specialized training, applied aggressively and intelligently to the specific problem at hand, creates capability that no other training can substitute for. Hawkins was killed on the second day of the battle, having been wounded the first day and having spent the night between refusing to go back to the ships. The airfield on Betio bears his name. The scout sniper platoons he saved from disbandment became, in the post-war Marine Corps, a central element of the Corps' tactical doctrine. Staff Sergeant William James Bordelon of San Antonio, Texas, represents the category of leadership that exists below the formal command structure, the non-commissioned officer, whose leadership is exercised not through orders or decisions about large units, but through direct, personal example at the point of contact. Bordelon was a combat engineer attached to one of the assault battalions. On D-Day, finding his unit pinned behind the seawall and taking casualties from positions that were holding up the advance, Bordelon began attacking those positions directly, charging fortified bunkers with demolition charges, destroying multiple positions that had been suppressing Marine movement, continuing to attack after being wounded multiple times. His actions were not ordered. They were responses to a situation that his training and his character told him required them. He was killed in the course of his attacks. The Medal of Honor he received posthumously is a formal recognition of what his immediate comrades knew the moment it was happening: that in a situation where almost everything had gone wrong, one man had decided that what he could control was his own action and had acted accordingly. The Japanese command at Betio presents its own leadership portrait, necessarily incomplete because the primary subject, Shibasaki himself, died on the first day, and the surviving accounts of Japanese leadership below his level are fragmentary. What the evidence suggests is a command structure that had prepared its subordinates to operate without centralized direction, in recognition of the reality that a sustained naval and air bombardment would disrupt communication and kill commanders. The individual position commanders at Betio, the lieutenants and warrant officers and NCOs who directed the defense of each bunker and pillbox, operated with significant autonomy for most of the battle, making tactical decisions about fire, counterattack, and last-stand positioning without being able to reach a superior for guidance. They performed this autonomous role with a consistency and determination that the Marine after-action reports noted explicitly. The defense of Betio was not directed from a single command post for most of its duration. It was a distributed defense, maintained by individual acts of unit discipline and personal commitment replicated in hundreds of positions across the island. General Holland Smith, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, the broader Marine force of which the 2nd Marine Division was a component, was engaged with the Tarawa operation at a level of command higher than the immediate tactical action, and his perspective on the battle was shaped by the larger strategic picture in a way that Smith's was not. Holland Smith's response to Tarawa was primarily analytical and reformist. He was among the most vocal senior officers in pushing for the doctrine revisions and equipment improvements that the battle's lessons demanded, and his institutional weight behind those revisions helped ensure that the after-action analysis translated into actual operational changes rather than being filed and forgotten. His relationship with the Army commanders during the concurrent Macon operation produced a friction that is itself instructive about the command dynamics of joint operations, the different operational cultures and different understandings of acceptable risk that the Army and Marine Corps brought to the same strategic situation, but that friction does not diminish the soundness of his push for reform. The contrast between the leadership at Betio and the leadership that had characterized earlier Pacific operations reflects a learning process that was occurring, in real time, within the American military, a process of discovering, through experience at increasing scale and intensity, what amphibious assault leadership actually required as distinct from what it had been assumed to require. The officers who led at Tarawa were not the officers who had led at Guadalcanal in all cases, and the Guadalcanal officers had not been the officers who had led at Wake Island. Each successive operation was teaching the Corps things about what it needed from its commanders that no pre-war doctrine had fully specified. The leaders who emerged from Tarawa, those who survived, carried forward an understanding of their trade that had been refined in the most demanding possible conditions. They applied that understanding in subsequent operations. The Marines who landed at Iwo Jima in February of 1945 were led, in significant part, by officers who had learned their craft at Tarawa and Kwajalein and Saipan, men whose judgment about what was possible and what was required in an opposed amphibious landing had been tested against the hardest standard, the Pacific. War provided. The leadership of the Navy corpsmen attached to the Marine units at Tarawa deserves explicit acknowledgement in any serious account of the battle's leadership dimension, because the leadership they exercised, the decision to treat a wound under direct fire, to expose oneself to reach a casualty who otherwise would not survive, to maintain the function of medical care in conditions that made that function nearly impossible, was leadership in the most unambiguous sense. The corpsmen at Betio were not commissioned officers exercising command authority. They were enlisted and petty officer medical personnel exercising something more fundamental, the authority of competence and compassion in a situation where both were desperately needed. Their casualty rate was significant. Their contribution to the survival of the men they treated is documented in the numbers. The percentage of wounded Marines who survived their wounds at Tarawa is a testimony to the quality of care provided in conditions that should have made quality care impossible. The leadership that made that care happen was the leadership of individuals who chose, repeatedly and under fire, to prioritize the need in front of them over the danger around them. Chapter 16. The Pacific War after Tarawa. The road to Iwo Jima. The Central Pacific in the months following Tarawa was transformed by the application of its lessons into a more capable and more efficient military machine. Not immediately, not completely, but in ways that were measurable in the casualty rates and operational timelines of every major amphibious assault that followed. The Marshall Islands campaign, launched in late January of 1944, was the first major test of the reformed doctrine. At Roynamur in the Northern Marshalls, the assault was preceded by a much longer and more intensive preliminary bombardment than Tarawa had received. UDT swimmers had reconnoitered the reef conditions. The number of Amtraks available was substantially greater. The command and control arrangements were better. The result, the Marshall Islands were secured faster, at lower cost per man committed, than Tarawa had been, was presented at the time as evidence that the system was learning. It was. The cost of that learning had been paid at Betio. The interest on that investment was being collected in the lives of men who came home from the Marshalls when they might not have come home from a Tarawa-scale operation. Kwajalein Atoll, the primary objective of the Marshall Islands campaign, was assaulted by both Army and Marine forces in early February of 1944. The tactical approach reflected the Tarawa lessons directly, a days-long preliminary bombardment that reduced the main island's fortifications far more thoroughly than the 2-hour bombardment at Betio had done. An assault that used Amtraks for all initial waves, rather than relying on Higgins boats to clear a reef that might not cooperate. Air support that was pre-planned and responsive in ways that the Tarawa operation had not achieved, and communication systems that, while still imperfect, were substantially more reliable than the ones that had left the Tarawa command ship effectively blind for most of D-Day. The casualties at Kwajalein were severe by peacetime standards. By Tarawa standards, they were dramatically lower. The comparison is not meant to minimize the cost of the Marshalls campaign. It is meant to show the direction of the learning. The Marianas campaign of June and July of 1944, the seizure of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, was the operation that fulfilled the strategic promise of the entire Central Pacific Drive. The Marianas provided the airfield bases from which the B-29 strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands would be conducted. They were also large enough and complex enough to require a scale of amphibious operation, multiple, simultaneous landings, large garrison populations, extended fighting over varied terrain that went beyond anything the Central Pacific Campaign had yet attempted. The battle for Saipan lasted approximately 3 weeks, cost more than 3,000 American dead, and involved fighting that, in some respects, was more complex and sustained than Tarawa, because Saipan was larger and more varied in its terrain and its defensive arrangements. The lessons of Tarawa were visible throughout in the pre-landing reconnaissance, in the Amtrak employment, in the air support integration. But Saipan also generated new lessons about the fighting in built-up areas and through varied terrain that would themselves feed into the doctrine for subsequent operations. The Battle of Peleliu in September of 1944 was in some ways the operation that most directly echoed Tarawa's combination of ferocious Japanese resistance and higher-than-projected American casualties. The 1st Marine Division, assaulting the island of Peleliu in the Palau Group, encountered a Japanese defensive system that had incorporated the lessons of Tarawa from the Japanese side, a system that de-emphasized the seawall and beach defense that had been the core of Shibasaki's approach and, instead, built on the natural cave and tunnel systems of Peleliu's coral limestone terrain, creating a defense in depth that could not be reduced by even the longest and heaviest naval bombardment because it was inside the rock rather than on its surface. Peleliu cost the 1st Marines a casualty rate comparable to Tarawa's over a much longer period, and it generated a debate still unresolved by military historians about whether the island needed to be taken at all, given that it was not on the main axis of the American advance. The debate about Peleliu's necessity is, in some respects, the debate about Tarawa's necessity with a different island's name attached to it. Iwo Jima, in February of 1945, was the operation that most completely expressed both the full development of American amphibious capability and the limits of what even a fully developed capability could achieve against a prepared and determined defender occupying terrain that provided extraordinary advantages. The Marine assault on Iwo Jima was preceded by 72 days of aerial bombardment and 3 days of naval gunfire, incomparably more preparation than the 2 hours of bombardment at Tarawa. The Amtrak fleet numbered in the hundreds. The UDT reconnaissance had been thorough. The command and control arrangements were the most sophisticated that the Pacific War had yet produced. And the battle still cost nearly 7,000 Marines dead and more than 19,000 wounded over 36 days of fighting against a Japanese garrison that had built its defense into the volcanic rock of the island, in a way that made Betio's coconut log bunkers seem modest. Iwo Jima demonstrated that the lessons of Tarawa, applied fully, could make an opposed amphibious assault more efficient and less costly in relative terms. But it also demonstrated that when the defending force is skilled, determined, and working with terrain that favors defense, the absolute cost of assault cannot be reduced to zero. It can be managed, it cannot be eliminated. The naval battle that accompanied the Marianas Campaign, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey, shoot by American pilots, represented the decisive defeat of Japanese naval air power in the Central Pacific, and it was made possible in part by the forward bases that the island-hopping strategy, inaugurated in earnest at Tarawa, had established. The carriers that fought the Philippine Sea battle operated from a position in the Central Pacific that the pre-galvanic American strategic posture had not been able to reach. The Gilbert Islands, secured at Tarawa's cost, had enabled the advance to the Marshalls. The Marshalls had enabled the advance to the Marianas. The Marianas had enabled the Philippine Sea battle. The chain of causation runs, link by link, from Betio's Beach back through every step of the advance, and it connects with the inevitability of strategic logic to the conditions that would eventually produce Japan's surrender. Tarawa was link one of that chain, and its cost, while it cannot retroactively become less than it was, can be understood as part of a progression that led somewhere. The Army Air Force's strategic bombing campaign against Japan, launched from the Marianas beginning in the autumn of 1944, was the operational fulfillment of the Central Pacific Drive's ultimate strategic purpose. The B-29 bombers that flew from Saipan and Tinian and Guam to strike Japanese cities were operating from bases made possible by the island-hopping advance, which had itself been made possible in terms of doctrine, equipment, and institutional learning by Tarawa. The connection between a Marine dying in the water off Betio in November of 1943 and the B-29 reaching Japanese airspace in the winter of 1944 is not rhetorical. It is operational and traceable. The forward bases, the refined doctrine, the improved amphibious capability, all of it linked the Tarawa experience to the strategic outcome of the Pacific War in ways that make Tarawa's cost, however terrible, a cost that belongs within the logic of the war's history rather than outside it. The relationship between the Central Pacific Drive and the parallel Southwest Pacific campaign came to its strategic convergence in the Philippines, where the forces of Nimitz and MacArthur, which had been advancing on separate axes toward Japan, came together in the autumn of 1944 for the liberation of the Philippine Islands. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, was fought in October of 1944 as the supporting naval action for the Leyte landings, and it resulted in the effective destruction of the Japanese fleet as a capable fighting force. The subsequent land campaign on Luzon and the smaller Philippine Islands consumed enormous resources on both sides through the spring of 1945. The amphibious operations that supported the Philippine campaign were conducted with the full benefit of the doctrine refinements that the Central Pacific Drive had generated, Tarawa included. The seamless integration of naval, air, and ground power that characterized the Philippine landings was the product of 2 years of learning, paid for engagement by engagement across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. The final amphibious operation of the Pacific War, the assault on Okinawa in April of 1945, was in many ways the ultimate expression of everything the American military had learned about opposed amphibious assault since the dark morning of the 20th of November, 1943. The preliminary bombardment lasted weeks. The UDT reconnaissance was exhaustive. The Amtrak fleet was armored and numerous. The close air support systems were responsive and precise. The medical evacuation architecture was the most developed in the Pacific War's history. And the battle that followed 82 days of fighting that cost more than 12,000 American dead and wounded, more than 38,000, was the hardest of the war. Not because the doctrine was wrong, but because the terrain and the Japanese defensive system, driven further underground and further into the island's natural cave networks by the accumulated lessons of every previous battle, had reached a level of defensive resilience that even the most refined American amphibious capability could not quickly or cheaply overcome. Okinawa was not Tarawa. It was much larger and much longer. But the line from Tarawa to Okinawa, the line of doctrine, of equipment, of institutional learning, applied across 2 years of combat is visible and direct, and it runs through every major operation of the Central Pacific Campaign. Chapter 17: Memory, Legacy, and the Ongoing Search. There are men from Betio still missing. Not metaphorically missing in the literal, physical sense that their remains have not been located, identified, and returned to the families who have been waiting for more than 80 years. The coral of the atoll absorbed the dead of November, 1943, and the subsequent decades the growth of the island's civilian population, the construction of buildings and roads and infrastructure on ground that had been a battlefield covered many of the grave sites that had been marked in the immediate aftermath of the battle. The initial post-war effort to consolidate the American dead to move them from the battlefield graves, where they had been interred in the immediate aftermath of the fighting, into formal military cemeteries, was incomplete. Some of the dead were moved, some were not found, some were found and could not be identified with the techniques available at the time. They stayed on Betio, in the ground of the island they had died to take, in graves that time and development eventually rendered invisible. The search for the Tarawa missing accelerated in the early years of the 21st century, driven by a combination of improved DNA identification technology, the organizational energy of private groups dedicated to recovering and identifying Pacific War casualties, and the advocacy of families who had spent decades waiting for an accounting that the official processes had not provided. The History Flight Organization, a private non-profit, undertook systematic excavation work on Betio beginning in the second decade of the 21st century, using ground-penetrating radar, historical records, and the oral knowledge of local Betio residents to locate burial sites that the post-war consolidation effort had not addressed. Their work has identified and recovered the remains of hundreds of Marines, whose identities have been confirmed through DNA matching with family members and returned to families who had, in some cases, given up hope of any resolution. The work continues. There are still men in the ground at Betio whose families are still waiting. The legal and diplomatic complexity of the recovery work, conducted on the territory of an independent nation, the Republic of Kiribati, which was established in 1979, adds a dimension to the ongoing Tarawa story that purely military histories tend to omit. The Gilbertese people whose ancestors lived on Tarawa before, during, and after the battle have their own relationship to the ground and to the history that was made on it, and that relationship is not simply deferential to the interests of the governments whose soldiers died there. The Republic of Kiribati has been a cooperative partner in the recovery efforts, but the relationship between the recovery work and the sovereignty and cultural interests of the Kiribati people requires ongoing negotiation and respect. The Betio of today is a living community, home to the largest concentration of population in Kiribati, a place where people work and raise children and go about their daily lives on ground that is simultaneously a civilian neighborhood and one of the most significant military historical sites in the Pacific. Those two identities coexist. Managing that coexistence with appropriate sensitivity to both is part of how the Tarawa legacy is being handled in the present. The memorial landscape of Betio reflects the battle's dual character, American and Japanese, attacker and defender, in a way that few Pacific War memorial sites fully achieve. There are American memorials marking the landing beaches and honoring the Marines who died there. There are Japanese memorials honoring the garrison that died defending the island. Both exist on the same small piece of ground within sight of each other, marking the same event from positions that were, in the event itself, separated by the width of a seawall. The coexistence of those memorials, the American flag and the Japanese markers on the same narrow island, is a kind of historical maturity, an acknowledgement that a battle belongs to both sides and that the grief of both sides has an equal claim on the ground where the dying was done. The men on both sides of that seawall were human beings. Their deaths were real. The memorials that mark those deaths, whatever uniform the dead were wearing, are appropriate. The question of how Tarawa is taught in military institutions, in history classrooms, in the broader cultural transmission of what the Pacific War was and what it cost, has evolved significantly over the decades since the battle. In the immediate post-war period, Tarawa was primarily a Marine Corps institutional story, a battle that the Corps claimed as central to its identity and its self-understanding. Gradually, as the academic study of the Pacific War deepened, and as the generation of survivors began to speak more fully about their experiences, the Tarawa story entered the broader historical curriculum in more complex forms. The simple "Marines took the island in 76 hours," narrative accurate as far as it goes, has been supplemented by more nuanced accounts that examine the planning failures, the human cost, the Japanese perspective, and the doctrinal legacy in ways that honor the full complexity of what happened. The evolution of how Tarawa is taught is itself a measure of historical maturity of a culture's growing capacity to hold its military history in its full complexity, rather than in the simplified forms that comfort requires. The documentary tradition around Tarawa, the films, the television programs, the long-form audio and video content that has been produced over decades to examine and re-examine the battle reflects the persistent public interest in an engagement that, for all its geographic obscurity and its relative smallness in the larger scale of the Second World War, continues to generate the kind of intense, detailed attention that is usually reserved for much larger and more famous battles. Part of this attention is the drama of the story itself, the tide that failed, the wade across the reef, the 76 hours. Part of it is the photograph legacy, those images that shocked the country in 1943 and continue to carry their full charge of documentary force more than 80 years later. And part of it is the doctrinal significance, the understanding, shared by military professionals and serious students of military history, that Tarawa was the turning point in the development of American amphibious capability, that the battle's lessons changed the shape of the Pacific War and of military doctrine for generations beyond it. The family legacy of Tarawa, the transmission of the battle's meaning through generations of families that lost someone at Betio, is a dimension of the story that resists quantification but refuses to be ignored. There are grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Tarawa veterans and Tarawa dead who carry the battle's name as part of their family identity, in the way that any significant ancestral experience becomes part of a family's understanding of itself. Some of these families have made the journey to Betio a significant undertaking, given the remoteness of the Kiribati Islands, to stand on the ground where their grandfather or great-uncle died, to see the lagoon, to touch the sand, to perform the act of physical presence at a site of family significance that no amount of documentary evidence or historical account can substitute for. Their presence on that island, in the 21st century, is a form of remembrance that connects the living to the dead across the 80-some years since the battle, in a way that is both intimate and historical simultaneously. The academic study of Tarawa has produced, over the decades since the battle, a body of scholarship that has refined and complicated the operational narrative in ways that continue to yield new understanding. The application of improved archaeological and forensic techniques to the physical evidence remaining on Betio has expanded the factual record in areas where documentary evidence was incomplete. The growing accessibility of Japanese archival sources translated and examined by a new generation of Pacific War scholars, with the language skills and the methodological frameworks to use them, has added dimensions to the understanding of the Japanese defensive planning and the garrison's experience that were simply not available to the first generation of historians who wrote about Tarawa. The Tarawa story continues to be written, not because its basic facts are in dispute, but because each generation of scholarship brings new tools and new questions to the evidence, and the evidence continues to yield new answers. The broader question of what Tarawa means not just to military historians or to the families of those who fought there, but to the wider culture that inherited both the legacy and the obligation, is one that resists any single definitive answer. It means different things to different communities. To the Marine Corps, it is identity and standard. To the families of the dead, it is loss and grief and the ongoing work of accounting. To the people of Kiribati, it is history written in their soil. To military professionals, it is the founding document of modern amphibious doctrine. To the broader American public, it is one of those events that punctuated the Second World War with a particular intensity of cost and consequence. All of these meanings are legitimate, all of them are partial. The full meaning of Tarawa, if such a thing can be approached, lies in the aggregate of all of them, in the space where the military history and the human history and the family history and the political history all intersect on that strip of coral barely wider than a city block, at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, at the turning point of a war that changed the world. Chapter 18. The Final Reckoning. What Betio teaches and what it demands. Every battle has things it teaches and things it demands, and those two categories are not always the same. The things a battle teaches are operational, the lessons about equipment, doctrine, planning, and execution that military institutions extract from the experience and apply to improve future performance. The things a battle demands are moral, the obligations that the cost of an engagement places on those who were not there, who did not pay, who inherit the world that the payment purchased. Tarawa is rich in both categories, and the distinction between them matters because the tendency of military history, like the tendency of most history, is to focus on what was learned and to underweight what is owed. The lessons of Tarawa have been studied, applied, and built upon for decades, and that application is a genuine and important legacy. But the moral weight that more than 1,000 American dead place on the living is not discharged by doctrine revision. It requires something else. What it requires, at minimum, is accuracy. The demand of the Tarawa dead is not that they be glorified, the photographs they left behind, those uncompromising images of the water and the seawall and the cost, argue against glorification with more force than any editorial judgment could. It is not that they be mourned in perpetuity, though grief is its own appropriate response to what was lost on that beach. It is that they be remembered accurately, that the full record of what happened, including the planning failures and the avoidable costs, and the institutional gaps that sent men into impossible conditions that better preparation might have ameliorated, be held alongside the courage and the endurance and the ultimate tactical success. Accurate memory honors the dead better than selective memory, because selective memory simplifies them into symbols, and the men who died at Tarawa were not symbols, they were people. The accuracy that their memory demands is the accuracy that restores their humanity. The planning failures at Tarawa, the tide intelligence gap, the underestimation of the garrison, the compressed bombardment, the communication fragility are part of the complete record, and they belong in the honest telling of the story, not as accusations against the men who made the decisions, but as evidence of what was not yet known and what the battle taught. The officers who planned Operation Galvanic were experienced, professional, and working from the best information available to them in the autumn of 1943. They made mistakes. Those mistakes cost lives. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the moral weight of the second is not diminished by the context of the first. The men who died in the water off Red Beach won because the tide did not come, and the Higgins boats stopped at the reef. They died partly because of a planning gap that better intelligence would have addressed. That is a fact of the record, and holding it alongside the courage and the sacrifice does not diminish the courage and the sacrifice. It completes them. The question of what a democratic society owes to the men and women it sends into its wars is one that Tarawa poses with particular sharpness, because the gap at Tarawa between what the men were told, that the bombardment would suppress the defences, that the tide would cooperate, that the fight would be short, and what actually happened was a gap measured in lives, not in strategic setback, not in delayed timelines, in the specific, irreversible deaths of men who had no ability to audit the assumptions behind the orders they were following. This is not an argument against the necessity of the operation. It is an argument for the obligation that falls on those who plan operations of this kind, the obligation to test every assumption, to exhaust every available source of intelligence, to allocate whatever time and resources required, to know the thing that needs to be known before the men go into the water. That obligation is not always fully dischargeable. War contains irreducible uncertainty that no amount of preparation can eliminate. But the gap between what is possible and what was done at Tarawa was real, and acknowledging it is part of the honest reckoning the battle demands. The legacy of Tarawa in the Marine Corps, that living institutional memory that has carried the battle's significance forward through generations of Marines who were born decades after the fighting ended, is one of the most genuine forms of the respect that the dead are owed. The Marine Corps did not simply study Tarawa as a historical case. It internalized, it made it part of the Corps' self-understanding, part of the vocabulary through which Marines across generations communicate what their institution is and what it requires of its members. When a young Marine in the 21st century is told that the Corps does hard things, that it accepts costs that other institutions would not accept, that its standard is set by what has already been endured, the unstated reference point of that tradition runs through Tarawa, among other places. The battle lives in the institution in the way that defining experiences live in any community that has been shaped by them, not always named, not always consciously invoked, but present in the culture's bones, informing its reflexes, shaping its understanding of what it is capable of and what it is obligated to attempt. The question of whether the Central Pacific strategy, the island-hopping approach that required Tarawa and every battle that followed it, was the best available strategy for defeating Japan, is one that historians have examined from multiple angles without reaching a fully settled conclusion. The bypass argument that some of the most costly island assaults could have been avoided by cutting Japanese garrison islands off from supply and leaving them to deteriorate has genuine merit for some operations. For Tarawa specifically, the airfield consideration made bypass difficult to justify operationally. But the broader strategic question about the pace and direction of the Pacific Drive, about the balance between the Central Pacific and Southwest Pacific axes, about the allocation of resources between the two approaches, is one that the historical record keeps alive, because the costs were real and the alternatives were not purely theoretical. Serious students of the Pacific War continue to debate these questions, and the debate is itself a form of the respect the dead deserve, an ongoing effort to understand whether every cost that was paid was a necessary cost, and where the answer is uncertain, to acknowledge the uncertainty honestly. The physical island of Betio today is almost unrecognizable as the place it was in November of 1943. The population has grown dramatically. Buildings and roads cover the ground where the bunkers stood and where the men fell. The lagoon is quieter. The reef is still there. The coral formation that stopped the Higgins boats and forced the wade is still precisely where it was, still barely submerged, still rising to near the surface on the low tides that come, as they always have, twice in the year. A visitor standing on the northern shore of Betio today, looking out across the lagoon toward where the American fleet assembled on the morning of the 20th of November, 1943, is standing on ground that carries an almost incomprehensible density of human experience per square foot. The reef is visible in the shallower water, perhaps 250 meters out, not 500 yards, but close enough that the geometry of what happened here is immediately legible to anyone who knows the story. The distance is not large. The cost was. The coral that lines the beaches of Betio is not the same coral it was in 1943. Coral regenerates, grows, changes over decades. But it is the same reef, the same fundamental geography, the same atoll, the same lagoon, the same equatorial sun that rose on the 20th of November and revealed, to the men in the water, the full extent of what they had been sent into. The permanence of that geography, the fact that the place where the battle happened still exists, still carries its physical form, still rises out of the Pacific, in exactly the position it occupied when the ships gathered around it, is one of the reasons that the pilgrimage to Betio carries, the weight it carries for the families and the veterans and the students of history who make it. The geography does not change, the tide still behaves the same way, the reef is still there. And the distance from the reef to the beach, that 500-yard wade that defined the first day of the battle and the first chapter of this story, can still be walked, at low tide, by anyone willing to enter the water and measure it with their own body. What the distance teaches you, if you make that walk, is that 500 yards in open water is a very long way. It is longer than it looks from the beach. It is longer than the maps suggest. It is the kind of distance that, covered in chest-deep water carrying 70 pounds of equipment with fire coming from the shore ahead of you, would take perhaps 15 or 20 minutes of continuous effort, 15 or 20 minutes during which you would be in the open, exposed, unable to take cover, unable to return effective fire, entirely dependent on the speed of your own movement and the quality of your own resolve to get you to the seawall that was the only cover available. 15 or 20 minutes is not a long time in ordinary life. On that reef, on the morning of the 20th of November, 1943, it was the entirety of some men's remaining lives. For the men who survived it, it was the defining experience of their existence, the thing against which every subsequent hardship would be measured and found manageable, the standard they had set for themselves that nothing that came after could exceed. The final reckoning of Tarawa, the balance sheet that the battle leaves in the historical record, cannot be reduced to a single verdict of justified or unjustified, necessary or avoidable, triumph or tragedy. It is all of those things, in different measures, from different vantage points. It was a tactical success, purchased at a cost that shocked a nation, and forced the wholesale revision of how amphibious warfare was conducted. It was a planning failure that sent men into conditions that better intelligence would have partially ameliorated, and a demonstration of human courage and endurance that only partially compensated for the failure. It was a strategic necessity in the logic of the Pacific War's advance, and a battle whose specific costs might have been lower if the specific preparation had been more thorough. It was a turning point in the development of American military doctrine, and a monument to the price that institutional learning extracts when an institution is learning in combat rather than in training. All of these things are true. None of them, alone, is the complete truth. What Tarawa demands, in the end, is simply this, that it be remembered, not sanitized, not simplified into a story of pure heroism or pure tragedy, not reduced to a casualty statistic or inflated into a mythology, remembered with the reef and the tide and the wade and the seawall, with the planning failures and the institutional gaps and the courage that partially compensated for them, with the men on both sides of the seawall who died in accordance with everything they had been formed by, with the families who received the telegrams and the survivors who carried the weight, with the Korean labourers who built the fortress and the Gilbertese people whose island it was before any of this began and whose island it remains. Remembered in its full complexity, with the honesty that the dead deserve and that the living owe, because the obligation of remembrance is the minimum that the living can offer to the men who paid the maximum, who waded into chest-deep water on a morning when the tide did not come, and kept walking. If you have stayed with us through all 18 chapters of this story, thank you. Not as a formality, as a genuine acknowledgement of what you have chosen to do with your time and your attention. The men of the 2nd Marine Division asked for nothing except to be remembered accurately. If the hours we have spent together tonight have given you something closer to that accurate memory, if the names and the places and the specific weight of what happened on that reef now occupy a real space in your understanding of what this war was and what it cost, then the telling has served its purpose. If this documentary has meant something to you, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who would value it. The Pacific War still has stories that deserve this kind of attention. We will keep telling them.